The subcommittee will come to order. The chair now recognizes himself for an opening statement. Well, good morning and welcome to the Environment, Manufacturing, and Critical Materials Subcommittee hearing on the fiscal year 2024 budget for the EPA. Administrator Regan, thank you for being here, and more personally, thank you for showing up in our little Appalachian village of East Palestine multiple times. I've seen firsthand how you've treated my constituents with compassion, working to enforce accountability, bringing your agency's technology tools and personnel to answer the questions and try and calm the fears of the residents, while supervising the ongoing emergency testing, cleanup, and assistance to those displaced. So from my perspective, the EPA can be a force for good. I've seen it firsthand in my community. However, I am concerned that at the national level, striking a balance in protecting the health of the environment with the safety, security, and economic freedom of the American people is taking a back seat at the EPA. Now, I understand you work at the pleasure of the president, but the statutory authority of your agency, Administrator Regan, comes from the laws Congress passes. And that authority is being abused to effectuate a vast set of troubling actions to pursue ideological green goals, apparently regardless in many cases of the consequences. Time and again, by its own admission, we've seen this administration first choose a policy goal, like forcing consumers to purchase all-electric cars, whether practical and affordable or not, shutting down oil and gas production, or shutting down reliable and dispatchable power generation, and then on the back end, attempt to shoehorn an EPA regulation in to achieve these ends. This is not what the EPA is designed to do. Republicans are for energy innovation, but we simply cannot deindustrialize the United States in pursuit of the 100% use of wind and solar power generation, which seems to be this administration's current policy. The results would be disastrous. So we're not going to go along with this idea of the ESG-inspired so-called energy transition that's now synonymous with the fantasy that the world will totally shut down the use of oil, natural gas, and coal. Yes, Republicans do care about the climate and the environment. And perhaps rather than a premature energy transition, we could change the conversation to an energy journey, one with very real grid reliability, grid resilience, safety, security, and economic considerations to address along the way. Now, regarding the subjects we'll cover today, they're best described as an EPA regulatory onslaught. Over 150 new regulatory actions underway. The agency is being used as the tip of the spear in the administration's premature pursuit of its green agenda. For example, EPA's Electric Generating Unit, or EGU strategy, undermines electric reliability by placing burdensome and economically unattainable requirements on coal-fired and gas-fired power plants. Consequently, reliability of our nation's electric grid is at risk, as many more of those plants will be prematurely shut down due to a litany of EPA regulations that take reliable energy off the grid with no plan for replacement. This will lead to more blackouts. Another problem is the EPA's proposal to dramatically lower the standard for fine particulate matter to a level that could bring nearly the entire country into noncompliance with the PM 2.5 standard. We need to encourage more manufacturing in the United States, not create standards so low that many of our small businesses and family farms can't function. Another concern is the EPA's proposed methane rule. This, on top of the new natural gas tax, oil and gas producers in my district would suffer immensely. Before you finalize the rule, Mr. Administrator, it's my hope that there will be clear-eyed, thoughtful consideration given to what the impact to our national security could be if American energy production is throttled right now, with a devastating, potentially expanding war in Europe and China becoming more belligerent in the Pacific. The world is becoming increasingly volatile, and in my view, choosing to curtail domestic fossil fuel production right now invites significant and unnecessary risk. Finally, President Biden's effort to force electric cars on an unwilling public is deeply troubling. This includes the SET proposal that would perversely introduce electricity into the Renewable Fuel Standard program, a final rule cracking down on heavy-duty trucks, and worst of all, proposed emission standards that would essentially eliminate gas-powered vehicles from the market. With all these actions and literally hundreds more, I'm concerned about the 19% increase for the EPA requested in the president's budget, on top of $60 billion from the IIJA and the $41.5 billion from the IRA. We're looking at $100 billion in taxpayer dollars extra to pay for actions that will further intrude into Americans' lives and throttle our economy. Mr. Regan, this is the opposite of accountability, and it's not reflective of the kind of work that your agency has done in my district. In closing, I want to highlight that Chair Rogers and I have sent you letters on a range of topics, IIJA and the IRA, the EGU strategy, the Clean School Bus Program, HFCs, and E-RIN's proposal. I appreciated the 3 responses we received yesterday and hope that you will commit to responding to the remaining letters promptly. Thank you, and with that, I recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Administrator Regan, for joining us. It is great to see you back at the subcommittee for today's discussion, President Biden's fiscal year 2024 budget requests. The chair of the subcommittee indicated your support for his district and your visits. Let me do likewise. Thank you for your efforts made in New York 20 that I represent. You're always welcome. We're a great partner on some of the projects we've initiated, and I appreciate your ushering us into a new era of energy and environment policy and thinking. We know the EPA has awesome responsibilities to protect public health and the environment. And more Americans are becoming increasingly aware of and concerned by environmental threats, including the danger of unmitigated climate change, the damage that can be caused by lead and PFAS in drinking water, and the risk from industrial accidents and chemical spills. The $12 billion budget request before Congress will allow EPA to fulfill its mission and address these and other pressing environmental challenges related to climate change, clean air, clean water, chemical safety, land remediation, and environmental justice. This funding will also help ensure effective administration of the historic funding that has already been provided to the agency over these past 2 years. I'm so proud of the legislative successes of the 117th Congress, and I am especially proud that many of the EPA policies and programs included in those laws were developed and championed by Democratic members of this given committee. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act included around $60 billion for EPA, which will enable the agency to make significant investments in our nation's crumbling water infrastructure, replace those lead service lines, remediate Superfund and brownfield sites, and deploy fleets of electric school buses across our country. But that is not all we accomplished. The Inflation Reduction Act included over $41 billion for EPA, which will address climate pollution, including methane and HFCs, and enhance environmental justice. These funds have the potential to reduce pollution and create jobs in every community across our great country. I have no doubt that these laws will improve people's lives, but I also acknowledge that there is still more work to do. And that starts by investing in the EPA itself, by growing its workforce to meet the scale of our nation's environmental challenges, enabling the agency to carry out effective regulatory and enforcement agendas while providing robust technical and financial assistance to our states, local and tribal governments, schools, and community-based organizations. I have the utmost respect for EPA's career employees, and I do hope the agency's management will do everything in their power to support the recruitment, the retention, and professional development of these outstanding public servants. So I was very happy to see the President's budget request over 1,900 new FTEs to ensure EPA is able to operate at full capacity. Finally, it is critical that EPA builds upon the historic IIJA and IRA funding by pursuing complementary and ambitious enforcement and regulatory agendas. EPA has significant existing legal authorities to tackle climate and traditional air pollution pollution from power plants and vehicles, keep PFAS chemicals out of commerce, and get the lead out of our water systems more quickly. I will continue to strongly encourage EPA to develop and finalize a suite of ambitious public health protections over this next year. Of course, this regulatory agenda must be driven by sound science, and these scientific efforts must be built on robust implementation of EPA's scientific integrity policy, which ensures employees can conduct their research and their analysis free from interference by political and special interests. EPA is one of our great federal science agencies, and its workforce must be confident that it can carry out its scientific mission without fear of being undermined. Administrator Regan, thank you again for joining us. Thank you for your outstanding work, and I look forward to working with you as EPA carries out its responsibilities, including implementing IIJA and IRA funding to indeed protect public health and our environment, and developing a complementary regulatory agenda. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Chair Rogers, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Regan, I appreciate you being here today. Our visions for the EPA should be aligned. America has the highest environmental labor standards in the world, and Energy and Commerce Republicans are committed to this legacy to ensure clean air, clean water, and continuing our leadership in reducing carbon emissions. Achieving this requires stewardship over how American hard-earned taxpayer dollars are spent. Unfortunately, that is not what we're seeing today at the EPA, as it seems that the focus is on President Biden's so-called climate agenda that is increasing prices on low and middle-income families, seeking control of the cars we drive, and making America dependent on Chinese supply chains that are dirtier and use slave labor. Since President Biden took office, the EPA has been injected with more than $100 billion in taxpayer dollars. This is on top of the annual appropriations funding. This is a 1,000% increase in spending. It's truly staggering, while the American people are already paying for record high inflation. And this increase is on top of the $60 billion in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the over $41 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act. The EPA doesn't need more money. Its regulatory agenda is out of touch with the needs of the American people. Last week, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, Unified Agenda and Regulatory Plan, listed 151 separate rulemakings pending from EPA. 151 pending rulemakings. This list contains some of the most aggressive mandates, shortening public comment periods, introducing regulatory changes that lack the analysis to justify them. These actions place substantial financial burdens on Americans that lower their standard of living, from blackouts in California to seasonal energy shortages in New England and the Midwest. The pain is being felt by people across the country. These impractical, expensive standards will eliminate good-paying jobs, destroy our manufacturing base and domestic supply chains, and threaten America's leadership in key industries that have historically been critical to our efforts to reduce emissions. For instance, a recent economic impact report by the National Association of Manufacturers found that EPA's proposed air quality regulations for particulate matter will jeopardize an estimated 850,000 manufacturing jobs and over $160 billion in economic activity. And this is on top of other EPA-enacted policies that are out of step with the congressional mandated authority to regulate. You know, just last year, the Supreme Court ruled in West Virginia versus EPA that EPA is exceeding its statutory authority. As the elected representative of the people, I was encouraged that the court ruled that EPA had exceeded their legislative authority. And they called upon Congress. They said that Congress needs to, on behalf of the people, hold the EPA accountable. I'm concerned when I consider 151 proposed rulemakings that there's additional abuses of power by the administration through all this rulemaking, and I want to assure you we're going to be watching very closely to ensure that the agency is not exceeding the authority, and that's our constitutional responsibility. I also wanted to highlight EPA's role in reviewing and approving human health water quality criteria. In December, the EPA set an unattainable PCB standard for human health water quality criteria in Washington State, my home state. Not only is this standard unattainable with current technology, it's not even detectable using EPA's approved last test methods. Even more troubling, it appears that the Washington State Department of Ecology is using an unapproved test method to determine whether job creators in Washington are in compliance with this unattainable standard. I want clean and safe water in Washington State. It's vital, it's life. But I also want regulations to be based on sound science and have predictability for the job creators, for our farmers, and for our manufacturing companies, our recycling plants. I'll close by making this appeal to you. The concerns we raise today are directly from the people that we represent, and we're concerned by the EPA's regulatory agenda and that is encroaching on our way of life and our future. You are accountable to the people through us, the elected representatives, and we're working to ensure that we can afford energy bills and drive the cars that we would like. That's freedom for a better life and to make the best decisions for ourselves. So I look forward to this discussion. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of the full committee, Representative Pallone, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Administrator Regan for joining us today to discuss the President's fiscal 24 budget request for the EPA. Let me just start out, I hear what the Republicans say, and, I respect them a great deal. But look, the EPA doesn't regulate for the sake of regulating. When I go home, people are asking me what you're doing to protect their health and safety. The fact of the matter is we have a lot of challenges out there that we didn't have 3 or 4 years ago, climate change being one of them. The hurricanes, the natural disasters are getting stronger, the sea level is rising, more problems with asthma and people's health. These are challenges that must be addressed. And what I hear when I go home is, I'm not, not that the EPA is over-regulating, but what's the EPA doing? What is the federal government doing to protect my health and safety? That's the bottom line. And you have to do that. And that costs more money. I mean, that's the reality. So I just wanted to say that last Congress, Democrats delivered historic wins for the American people that are directing investments into communities around the nation. The bipartisan infrastructure law invested $1.2 trillion to modernize our nation's aging and crumbling infrastructure. It included EPA funding to ensure Americans have access to safe and clean water by making infrastructure upgrades and replacing lead pipes to reduce harmful exposure. The law is also revitalizing communities by cleaning up Superfund and brownfield sites. People are concerned about contamination from these sites. People are concerned about their health and how lead pipes impact their health. You're trying to address those things. The Inflation Reduction Act will help us lead the world in the transition to a clean energy economy by producing homegrown clean energy, combating the climate crisis, creating millions of good-paying jobs, lowering energy costs, and building a more healthier, sustainable future. This is what people are concerned about in my district. This law was enacted 9 months ago, and it's already producing major results. Projects valued at tens of billions of dollars are already underway. More than half of them are in Republican congressional districts, and more than 142,000 clean energy jobs have been created. And yet not one Republican on this committee supported either of these bills. Instead, my Republican colleagues have spent the first month of their majority fixated on undermining these investments and these environmental protections at every turn. And now they're threatening a default crisis with their Default on America Act that puts polluters over people. Republicans have made their agenda clear: repeal the Inflation Reduction Act and provide broad carve-outs to bedrock environmental laws for polluters at the expense of the health and safety of workers and families. This is unpopular, short-sighted, and it puts the economy at great risk. In sharp contrast, the President's budget request builds on the success of these unprecedented investments and reflects Democrats' commitment to the health, safety, and prosperity of all American families. To combat the climate crisis, the budget increases funding for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and helping communities build resilience to the impacts of climate change. It also allocates $1.4 billion to improve air quality across the country. EPA will also drive down super pollutants with methane reduction programs and the implementation of the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, a bipartisan law to curb the production and use of potent hydrofluorocarbons in our atmosphere. That one was done when Trump was president, and we did it on a bipartisan basis. The budget request supplements the reinstatement of the Superfund tax to fund more cleanup activities. I've fought for decades to reinstate this tax, and thanks to these two bills, it is once again a reality. Over 20% of Americans live within 3 miles of a Superfund site, and remediating and revitalizing contaminated properties will create jobs, mitigate threats to human health, and directly benefit the communities affected by these sites. The budget also bolsters EPA's work to advance environmental justice by using the new Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights to help deliver on its commitments to the communities who have struggled with legacy pollution for far too long. I'm also pleased to see that the budget devotes $170 million to combating PFAS and increases funding to effectively implement the Toxic Substances Control Act, again, bipartisan, allowing the agency to evaluate and manage risks from toxic chemicals, protecting workers and families. So this is a budget request that will ensure EPA can fulfill its mission to protect human health and the environment. To be successful, EPA must have adequate funding and staff to meet the statutory obligations set by Congress, and I think the President recognized this. So once again, I just have to say, I listen to my Republican colleagues, when I go home, this is what people care about. They're worried, they want to clean up these sites, they don't want pollution, they don't want asthma to get worse. That's what you're trying to do, and that's your job, and I commend you for doing it, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Our witness today is the Honorable Michael Regan, Administrator of the EPA. Administrator Regan, as I mentioned, you have demonstrated to me personally and to our state, you can be a force for good. I've seen it firsthand. I'm hopeful that at the end of this hearing and as we move forward working together, that we'll be able to come to that common sense balance of protecting the environment at the same time that we consider and protect the safety, the energy security, the national security, and the economic freedom for the American people, that we attain that balance. I think you're capable of doing that, but we'll see. You're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson and Chairwoman McMorris-Rogers, Ranking Members Tonko and Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the necessary vision laid out in the United States Environmental Protection Agency's proposed fiscal year 2024 budget. Chairman Johnson, I'd also like to take a moment to thank you for your leadership. I'd like to thank you for your partnership. We would not be where we are or have accomplished what we have without your leadership. You are an incredible advocate for your community. I'm grateful for that. In this budget request, we lay out an ambitious and transformative plan for EPA with the goal of building a healthier, more prosperous nation while ensuring global competitiveness, energy independence, and energy security. President Biden's proposed FY 2024 budget request for EPA provides $12.1 billion to advance key priorities, including protecting air quality, upgrading our nation's aging water infrastructure, tackling the climate crisis, and rebuilding some core functions at the agency. Over the last year, EPA has made significant progress towards many of these goals. We've taken action to cut smog and hazardous air pollution from power plants, which will reduce the risk of cancer in some nearby communities by 96%. We've taken strides to ensure that all people have clean water by proposing the first ever legal limits for PFAS and investing billions to remove 100% of lead pipes across our country. And we've accelerated our transition to a clean transportation future by proposing the strongest ever standards for cars and trucks, while awarding 2,400 clean school buses to school districts all across the country. I'm proud of the foundation we've laid and the partnerships that have underpinned our successes. But there's still so much more work to do to ensure that all of our children have safe, healthy places to live, learn, and play, to build a stronger, more sustainable economy, and to advance American innovation and ingenuity. Simply put, investing in EPA is investing in America. Across the country, poor air quality still affects millions of people, perpetuating harmful health and economic impacts. In fiscal year 2024, the agency will protect our air quality by cutting emissions of ozone-forming pollutants, particulate matter, and air toxics. The President's budget includes $1.4 billion to improve air quality and to set standards that reduce pollution from mobile and stationary sources. EPA's work to set these standards provides certainty to industry, builds on advances in technology, reinforces market movement towards a clean energy system that provides affordable, reliable energy. A thriving economy also requires clean and safe water for everyone. Although progress has been made, many still lack access to healthy water, face inadequate wastewater infrastructure, and suffer from the effects of lead pipes. America's water systems are also facing new challenges, including cybersecurity threats, climate change, emerging contaminants such as PFAS. The budget proposes more than $4 billion to upgrade drinking water and wastewater infrastructure nationwide, with a focus on underserved communities. Over the last year, I've had the privilege of traveling across the country, from Jackson, Mississippi, to visiting East Palestine with you, Mr. Chairman. I've seen firsthand the environmental and public health challenges many of our constituents continue to experience. I've spoken to families who've been sickened by the air they breathe. I've met with people who live with toxic waste in their backyards. I've seen conditions that are simply unacceptable in the United States of America. From investing in our nation's climate resilience to cleaning up contaminated land and water, there is no shortage of important work to be done. Members of the committee, EPA is up to the task, and we're eager to work with all of you to deliver for our fellow Americans and to secure our nation's global competitiveness. But we need your support. Both the urgency and economic opportunity presented by climate change require that we leave no stone unturned. I'd also like to take a moment to remind folks that we must keep moving forward. 2024 will undoubtedly present a unique set of challenges, and moving backwards certainly is not an option. Reverting back to the fiscal year 2022 budget would force the agency to make very difficult trade-offs. EPA would have to cut hundreds of millions of dollars from programs that protect communities all across America, impacting our ability to hire critical staff, including toxicologists, engineers, scientists, and others who play a crucial role in protecting this country and the people and the planet. Cuts would make it harder to address dangerous contaminants like PFAS and would slow our progress to replace lead pipes. President Biden's budget positions EPA to create durable environmental policy, invests in America, and sets our nation on a path to win the 21st century. It will also allow us to address the environmental concerns of millions of Americans and fundamentally improve people's lives for the better. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here today and submit this testimony for the record, and I look forward to our continued partnership to achieve these ambitious yet necessary goals, and welcome all questions. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back, and I will begin the questioning, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Administrator Regan, EPA's actions have been forcing premature closures of important coal-fired generating sources, which has undermined electric reliability. And new regulations promise to drive even more premature closures as part of your EGU strategy. After Congress and electric system operators raised concerns about reliability, you issued a memorandum of understanding with DOE on reliability this past March. I have a copy of it right here. The MOU states that EPA, quote, gives careful consideration to electric reliability implications as it develops and implements regulations for electric generating facilities. It states further that EPA engages with stakeholders, including independent system operators and RTOs, in developing regulations that are consistent with maintaining reliability. So I want to dig into this MOU a little bit. Administrator, reports from the ISOs and RTOs tell a different story. Did you consult the operators of the nation's electric grids about your EGU strategy? You have, okay. Well, you might want to consult with them again. I'm entering into the record a report from PJM Interconnection and a Wall Street Journal article on this topic entitled SOS for the Electric Grid. This report's findings are simple. We are shutting down too much reliable power on the grid, accelerated by EPA regulations with no plans to replace it. So, Mr. Administrator, I want to get it on record today. The state of Ohio, my constituents, and over 60 million Americans in total get their power on the PJM or PGM grid. Can I go back to my district and tell them that they will enjoy equal to or better electric reliability in 2030 as they do today?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and I'll say that.
That's great. I got a lot of questions to ask you, so that's an important question and an answer. Are you confident the regulatory impacts of your rules would pass an independent reliability review by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC?
I am.
Okay. Reports indicate EPA's new Clean Power Plan rulemaking, replacing the one rejected by the Supreme Court as part of West Virginia versus EPA, will conveniently be announced tomorrow after this hearing. Will you provide a broad and diverse array of stakeholders, including RTOs and ISOs, and affected states more than 60 days to review and comment on those proposals?
We can consider that.
Okay. Would you commit to returning to this committee to discuss this proposal?
You know, I am committed to transparency, whether that be in front of this committee or
I'll
providing
give you
all
an
of your staffs.
opportunity. I'll call you back. Thank you very much. Administrator Regan, I'd like to ask about EPA's plans to impose new regulations for methane on top of the IRA's new methane fee, the natural gas tax. I'm concerned that new taxes and regulations will, as CBO reported, increase compliance costs, reduce energy production, and increase energy prices. I don't believe EPA has statutory authority to regulate methane as proposed. And because there are significant questions about how the methane fee and the methane regulations will interact with each other. So, Mr. Administrator, will EPA's new taxes and regulations on natural gas increase prices for the American people?
I can't speak to the taxes piece. I'm not quite sure if I understand that.
Can you get back to me on that? Can you ask your team? Okay. Will you agree to not finalizing any rule that increases consumer prices or produces or reduces energy production?
We do a very careful cost-benefit analysis for all of our rules that are proposed.
But that's not what I asked you. I said, will you agree to not finalizing any rule that increases consumer prices or reduces energy production?
It'll be hard to tell whether it's solely our rule that increases prices. I think that we can walk you through the cost-benefit analysis that we use to propose all of our rules.
Do you believe EPA has authority to expand the natural gas tax to other sources or sectors beyond oil and gas producers like agriculture, for example?
We're not expanding the tax, so I'd like to talk to you in detail about the.
Do you think you
rule
have
that
the
we
authority to
propose.
do that?
We don't have authority or
Okay.
have not proposed any tax.
What is the status and timeline for EPA to finalize the rulemaking for collecting the new methane fee?
Hopefully before the end of this year. We've received over 500,000 comments the first time, close to 500,000 the second time as well, so we're carefully going through those comments.
Okay, with that, I yield back. I now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again, Mr. Administrator. As I stated earlier, EPA's workforce has so many talented and dedicated public servants that are working hard to fulfill the agency's mission. I appreciate EPA is making a concerted effort to recruit a more diverse and inclusive workforce as it seeks to provide the next generation of environmental experts with career opportunities. From 1992 through 2012, EPA consistently had around 17,000 employees. Since 2013, that number has hovered around 14,000 to 15,000 when there was this anti-science message coming through the agency of late prior to your administration. We know that some left demoralized and some rushed their retirement plans. We know EPA is being asked to address more numerous and more complex challenges and administer historic levels of funding. For years, we've been asking these employees to do more with less. So, Mr. Administrator, I know the budget request would get EPA back to that 17,000 level. How important is that part of the request? And can you please update us on EPA's efforts to hire qualified people to support implementation of the very important IIJA and IRA policies?
Well, thank you for the question, and it's absolutely important. I think when we look at the decline of our staff, qualified staff, The areas that have been hit the hardest are those areas where we want to give farmers more tools. So when we look at our pesticides and our herbicides and looking at putting new products on the market, we need to get those things through review. When we look at the implementation of TSCA and look at how we evaluate and assess all of these chemical compounds that are very dangerous to our society, we need those staff members. Yes, we receive resources from Bill to address lead in drinking water, but a recent study we did found that 9.2 million people in this country are exposed to lead. We only receive $15 billion. We estimate that there's $43 billion in need. So as we look at hiring our staff, we want to keep pace with all of these environmental challenges. And the last thing I'll say is 85% of this budget we're requesting goes through EPA to our states and our regional partners. So this is building capacity at our state levels so our states have the ability to continue to have autonomy and comply with these federal laws.
I appreciate that. The infrastructure law funding will reduce the risks of lead, PFAS, and other contaminants in Americans' drinking water. But we know funding is only part of the solution. EPA has also been working on standards that will further protect our communities. So, Mr. Administrator, I know EPA is updating the Trump administration's lead and copper rule revision. I believe this is a critical complementary action to the $15 billion provided by the infrastructure law to replace lead lines. Can you provide an update on the lead and copper rule, and how can this rule enable us to get every lead pipe out of our water systems?
It's a very important piece of the work, and we've been working hard. We anticipate proposing the lead and copper rule in 2023 and finalizing in 2024. It is a priority for the agency, and we want to be able to have this rule that will complement the resources that Congress gave us through the bipartisan infrastructure law.
Thank you. And similarly, EPA is working to address the traditional air and climate pollution, building upon funding and tax incentives included in the Inflation Reduction Act. Mr. Administrator, I know we are expecting a proposed Clean Air Act standard for power plants in the near future. I'm guessing you cannot comment on the specifics of this rule, but can you provide us with the background on the process that has led to its development?
We've been engaging the power sector for almost 2 years now, grid operators, state agencies as well. We have been also focused on staying well within the confines of the Supreme Court and the decision on West Virginia. And what we're going to do is propose a rule that sets an emission limit but gives the power sector maximum flexibility in terms of their technology choices to reach that, whether it's best management practices, whether it's CCUS, whether it's battery storage or renewables. There's a range of options that the Inflation Reduction Act, along with this rule, gives our power sector for this opportunity.
Thank you. And why is reducing emissions from polluting power plants an important complement to the IRA incentives for clean energy in our comprehensive national climate action plan?
Well, we know that whether it's SOx or NOx or mercury or climate pollutants, they're disproportionately impacting a number of people in this country. And all of our technology standards are just that. They're technology standards, meaning these technologies or these practices exist and can be put in place from a cost-benefit perspective. And so we believe in engaging with the power sector and moving forward, this is a complement to where the market has been going for the past 10 years. I know people continue to reference the West Virginia case. That was a rule proposed 2 administrations ago. That's not the Biden administration's rule. And so as we look at our rule moving forward, ours will be in line with West Virginia, it'll be in line with our statutory authority, and it'll be in line with the conversations we've been having with the power sector for almost 2 years now.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator. I appreciate building up of quality staff and the morale enhancement that is also followed. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. John Joyce, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Administrator Regan for appearing here today. I am very concerned about the EPA's proposed ETO emissions and draft regulation decision. While the EPA acknowledges that your actions could lead to sterilizer facility closures and cause shortages in sterile medical devices, the EPA does not identify the magnitude, size, impact, or location of these shortages. In college, I spent a summer in the central supply and sterilization unit of a community hospital. I can say with firsthand knowledge how critical adequate sterilizing procedures are for surgery and for medical procedures, and ultimately for patient safety. That is why I'm particularly concerned when I hear the FDA's Director of Partnership and Technology Innovation, Dr. Susan Schwartz's warning on this matter, and I quote her, "We would be concerned if even one additional facility shut down. We will start to see spot shortages. There is no question about that. In terms of more catastrophic national impact, with 2 facility shutdowns, it is almost a certainty," unquote. At an event on April 28th, FDA Commissioner Kaloff was asked about the ETO rulemaking and stated, quote, "This issue is very much on the forefront for us. We are highly aware of it, and we are engaged in discussions. I'm very worried," unquote. FDA submitted extensive comments to the EPA as part of the interagency review, and it appears that none of them were addressed by the EPA. So now, I'm very worried. Question for you, Administrator Regan. Do you commit that the EPA will not publish a final rule until it has developed plans that the FDA has approved to ensure that a sufficient supply of all sterilized medical devices, and can make a commitment that these rules will not impact patients' access to safe, sterile medical devices or put any lives at risk?
We absolutely will make the commitment to continue to work with the FDA and ensure that our rules do not have any kind of worry for the FDA, along with these facilities. And let me just say that our path to this has been with the backdrop of the EPA Inspector General citing us for not acting and complying with the law.
I think that dialogue is so important. I thank you for that commitment. And while I appreciate your efforts, my concern as a doctor is to ensure that my patients, my constituents, receive the care and the safety that they need with that care. Can you commit to providing our committee with a briefing alongside the FDA by May 24th so we can be assured that the EPA's actions do not impact patient access to critical sterile medical devices?
We can commit to that.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate that. And now, figuratively and literally switching gears, I'm also concerned about a potential waiver granted by the EPA for California's Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulations. These regulations will mandate 100% electric vehicle sales by 2035. Since 17 states representing over 40% of the automotive market have already adopted some aspect of California's regulations, this mandate has a potential to spread rapidly. Administrator Regan, do you think that it is appropriate that granting one state a waiver will dramatically disrupt the entire American automobile market?
We have not received the waiver that you're referencing.
We will make sure that you receive that. And I want to just have a
It would
clarification.
have to come from the state of California. The state of California hasn't submitted a waiver for Clean Cars to the EPA.
We will make sure that you see what that waiver is. Do you feel that your administration and the Biden administration supports the ban of selling new vehicles with internal combustion engines starting in 2035?
No, not at all.
You do not support a ban of internal combustion automobiles or any vehicles by 2035?
No, I don't support that, and neither do our regulations. By the way, our regulations don't ban anything. They're technology standards that guide the future and especially complement the market.
Do you support that the consumer should have the choice of what type of vehicle they drive, that the trucking industry, that the automobile industry has that right to purchase individual vehicles that have internal combustion engines?
I absolutely do. That's why I'm such a strong proponent of E15 biofuels, advanced biofuels. I don't see a near-term future where we don't have a fuel supply that complements electric vehicles and provides customers choice.
I think it is so important that those individual choice by my constituents, by the American public, are so important. Thank you for making that commitment to us today. Thank you again for presenting yourself to us today. And Chairman Johnson, I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Regan, thank you so much for coming to spend the morning with us. We appreciate it. We appreciate the job you and your agency are doing, and also trying to rebuild the personnel and the morale over there. It's really important. In a recent hearing, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle made what I thought was the stunning statement that we all breathe the same air and we drink the same water. People like me who represent underserved communities know that these communities frequently have, they're low-income, disadvantaged minority communities, they frequently have multiple sources of pollution that compound on one another, which has a negative impact on the community's health and leads to increased rates of asthma and cancer, among other diseases. And in my own congressional district, you've heard me talk about this before, we have an area called Globeville, Elyria, Swansea. It's a neighborhood that's just downwind of an industrial area. And so I want to ask you, what actions does EPA plan to take during this Congress to alleviate the environmental and health risks of the cumulative impacts for these communities?
Well, thank you for that question. And there are two things that we've done. The first is we've established a new national program that's laser focused on environmental justice and external civil rights to be sure that all Americans are receiving the equal protection under the law. The second is that we've committed to take a number of steps to address cumulative impact, in particular from multiple sources of pollution, especially those experienced by overburdened communities. The Office of Research and Development has developed or issued a report on cumulative impacts, and our Office of General Counsel has published the Cumulative Impacts Addendum to our legal tools, which lays out our authorities and our ability to address cumulative impact. I've traveled all across this country. In the state of California, West Virginia, North Carolina, we know that communities are being disproportionately impacted because of income or because of race. We have to address this issue.
Thank you. Now, how does this budget this year, in tandem with the investments that we made in the Inflation Reduction Act, help you to achieve these goals with the agency?
Well, it continues to help us to build on the staff. A lot of the resources that came from the Inflation Reduction Act were for grants or programs. And so, number one, we need to have the technical expertise at headquarters and in our regions to work with our communities to ensure that everything we do is viewed through that environmental justice lens.
Thank you. Now, Administrator, the President's budget includes $757 million and 3,354 FTE to strengthen environmental enforcement, which is really important because these communities I talked about are frequently the targets of repeated violations. So how does the EPA plan to follow up through its enforcement requirements that will help eliminate violations from repeat offenders?
Well, I appreciate that question because that is definitely something that the EPA Inspector General highlighted for us and indicated that our lack of enforcement capacity jeopardizes our ability to meet our statutory obligations. And so we've lost more than 900 FTE since 2011, or actually in 2022. And so we are looking for this budget to not, replace all 900, but help us get back on that trajectory so we can protect our communities, especially our most vulnerable communities.
Yeah, you can't, if you don't have the personnel to do the enforcement, then you can't just get that out of thin air.
We're forced to prioritize the worst offenders, and you're right, we cannot adequately complete our mission.
Yeah. I was really heartened in your opening statement to hear you talking about replacing the lead service lines across the United States. My community of Denver was one of the communities, and we're still working through our problem, but because of the lead variance issued by the EPA under the Safe Drinking Water Act, Denver Water has been able to put together a comprehensive approach for reducing lead in drinking water. So I want to ask you briefly, how is EPA using successful programs like the one in Denver to work with other cities and towns to make sure that everybody has access to clean, lead-free drinking water?
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for Colorado and Denver's leadership on this issue. Denver has a variance program that allows for accelerated progress, and so there's some flexibility and innovation built into Denver because of the city's unique experiences. We're studying that. We're studying those local experiences, whether it be Denver or Newark or Chicago. We know that one size doesn't fit all, and we want to match our resources with the local innovation.
Thank you so much, and I renew my invitation for you to come out and look at Globeville, Elyria, Swansea with me. Thanks.
Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Administrator Regan, the summer is almost officially here. I'm sure you noticed my ice cream suit by now. And I understand that the chairman has invited you back, and hopefully if you come in May, you'll get to wear Colonel Sanders' suit as well. So just a little fun there. I want to ask you about the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, or AIM Act. Before I was elected to Congress, I owned and operated an HVAC company in Texas, and I know that keeping systems cooling folks in the summer literally is a matter of life or death. This is why Congress took great care in AIM to ensure an adequate supply of hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs, that would be available for the lower cost HVAC system refrigerant. Let me put that in perspective from personal experience. And we can talk about underserved communities, or we can talk about low socioeconomic. I forget exactly what the representatives get, the terms y'all used. But because of the rules that were put in place by the federal government, you went into somebody's house, and if they needed an evaporator coil that was leaking up in the attic or in a closet, it might be a $1,000 job. But because they increased efficiencies, SEER ratings on units that used a different form of refrigerant, now the outside unit had to be changed. A lot of the ductwork, the plenum work had to be changed to match the larger system. And now it becomes an $8,000 or $9,000 job. Well, just imagine a family who is struggling, who wasn't sitting around waiting thinking, I hope my coil goes out. I got $1,000 set aside. Now, all of a sudden, they've got to come up with $9,000. And so those rules are really, really hurting American families, especially in my district. That was my experience. And so it feels like the EPA went out of its way to help AIM supporters with implementation. But has the EPA done it, or have you deprioritized implementing this pro-consumer portion of the law until the very end? In other words, low-cost refrigerant needs to be available to those people. What say you?
Thank you for that. I would remark I'm from North Carolina, not afraid of a seersucker suit, so got one ready for you. And you know, I think we have worked really hard with the manufacturers on the implementation. I will double back with my staff to see if we are at this point here. But I think we've reconstructed the allocations. We've worked very hard with the manufacturers on the execution of this rule. And if there's something outstanding on that last leg of it, I'd like to talk to you about it.
Please do, because it really impacts the lower income people a lot more than maybe professionals, for example. It doesn't matter what their race, color, or creed is. If the professional people have 2 salaries and they're able to set aside some money, they're able to maybe manage that shock, because it's a shock to your budget. I've seen too many times standing in somebody's house where they just can't believe it's happening to them. And so please check into that and get back to us.
Absolutely.
Based on the EPA's timing, Americans are going to have no choice to pay for more air conditioning, higher prices this summer. When is the earliest time you think you can be back and wear that suit for us?
I'll circle with my staff and see what we can do.
Okay. Secondly, Administrator Regan, sound chemical management policies are critical to American innovation and competitive. EPA's approach to chemical management can have a direct impact on America's ability to be an innovation leader, whether building and construction, materials to semiconductors, healthcare and energy solutions like EVs, wind turbines, and solar panels. Last week, EPA issued a proposed TSCA rule, Toxic Substances Control Act rule, where they announced it was missing information about economic impacts and workplace exposures and practices, and asked the affected industry, those industries, to submit this information to the EPA. I'm also told that the EPA proposal did not take into account supply chain disruptions and whether risk management action could adversely affect critical infrastructure, IRA investments, and national security objectives, something I would hope this administration would care about. Public comment rule period has been set for 60 days. EPA has said it will use its applied similar regulatory practices for this chemical analysis, despite critical data missing and sloppy scientific and regulatory impact analysis in future TSC, or Toxic Substance Control Act cases. Will you commit now to extending the comment period past the 60 days so that those same stakeholders are capable of collecting and providing EPA's requested information, and to enable the agency to conduct the necessary comprehensive review of supply chain and infrastructure impacts.
Well, let me say that I don't think that we have proposed a rule that is incomplete. There may have been a request for additional information during the comment period, but I don't believe we've proposed an insufficient rule. I will tell you, though, that because of the historic investments that we've seen, whether it be CHIPS and Science Act or IRA, we're taking all of this stuff into consideration. It absolutely is on my mind that we would propose something that would disrupt our pursuit of semiconductor and or domestic
So
manufacturing.
you can get back to us on that.
Sure, I will, absolutely.
My time's up. Thank you, Mr. Administrator. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, as time has expired, the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank you so much, Administrator Regan. I appreciate the work that you've done. I also wanted to give a little shout out to our regional administrator, Deb Shore, who I think has done a great job for the whole region. I'm from the city of Chicago, but the work that she did with the railroad crisis, I think, has been really exemplary. So I have a particular thank you for you. Illinois is number 2 in the country when it comes to lead service lines. And I really appreciate the fact that you have done, completed the review of the drinking water infrastructure needs survey. And as a consequence of that, Illinois is getting more money than we had originally been allocated, and that means so much. Chicago alone has over 400,000 lines that need to be replaced. So I want to thank you for that. I also just wanted to note that the International Panel on Climate Change put out such a dramatic warning to all of us. And I think all of our colleagues have to acknowledge that we are on the verge, if we don't take urgent action, immediate action right now, that we'll be unable to avoid some of the worst effects of climate change right now. So I am concerned right now that what we are seeing is that the Republican colleagues of mine have decided that there ought to be the repeal of the infrastructure reduction, what is it? Anyway, we're talking about problems of the reversal of bills that we have passed, and I am very concerned. I wanted to ask you about that. Yes, the infrastructure reduction, the Inflation Reduction Act would, if they had their way, include taking away the inclusion of the Methane Emissions Reduction Act and also the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. And I want to ask you, what is the consequence to not only the EPA, but to our constituents and their health care and their jobs if those bills were repealed?
Well, I think we're working extremely hard on developing the framework for the $1.5 billion for the methane program. I think the industry has indicated that they want those resources to help with mitigation, to help with technical assistance, and so we're working very hard. That $1.5 billion is very important to the industry. I think when you look at the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, $27 billion that we are working with independent organizations to partner with the private sector to leverage those resources to invest in advanced technologies. especially those that would grow jobs, create an economy, but also grow jobs locally. There's a tremendous opportunity there. So these are economic and technology opportunities, just as importantly as they are human health opportunities as well. It will be a major setback, and I think that industry and many of our stakeholders fought aggressively to get those provisions into the IRA, and it would be a shame to see that taken out.
Do you have any estimate of how many jobs actually could be lost if these programs didn't move forward?
I'll circle back and have my team give you sort of a breakdown of what we estimate the job impact potential could be. We know that there is significant, especially when we think about being competitive in the 21st century. It's really significant.
Let me just also say how concerned I am if there actually were a great reduction back to a couple of years ago of funding for the EPA, what it would mean for our ability to save these programs and additionally to save our planet. So thank you very much for the work that you do. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, Ms. Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The EPA's vehicle emissions proposal is really seeking to transform the domestic auto market so that 2/3 of the new vehicle sales will be battery electric vehicles in less than 10 years. By 2032, 2/3, without regard to what people want, whether the infrastructure charging exists, and still being dependent upon continued subsidies. Now, Mr. Administrator, you may argue that these rules don't ban any kind of cars. They only set a technology standard. But the way that they are written, it is a de facto ban on vehicles that aren't battery electric vehicles. Hybrids won't qualify. Plug-in hybrids won't qualify. Hydrogen, propane, and certainly the internal combustion engine won't qualify, regardless of what people want. Now, on affordability, the average price of an EV, a battery electric vehicle, is $65,291, which is more than $17,000 than the average price of current cars. Mr. Administrator, the raw materials required to build one battery electric vehicle could instead be used to build 90 hybrids. The overall carbon reduction of those 90 hybrids over their lifetime is 37 times as much as one battery electric vehicle. So my question is, why did EPA propose a tailpipe emission standard that phases out the environmental improvements and practical benefits offered by hybrids?
Well, thank you for the question, and I just don't believe that that's the case. I think the proposed rule, which is out for discussion, has a range of 53 to 67% of vehicles sold by the year 2032. We're talking about way out to 2032. And so I just don't believe that there is a dire choice here. We are also promoting advanced biofuels, and biofuel infrastructure as well. So I just don't quite
Reclaiming my
see it.
time, I'll just say, I guess you'll hear during the comment period, but there are grave concerns about the way this rule is written and the impact that it's going to have, decisions that will have to be made today in order to get us to this mandate by the Biden administration of 2/3 of new car sales being battery electric only by 2023. So the proposed tailpipe emissions standard is driving us further towards China dependence. China controls 50 to 70% of the global lithium and cobalt. Can you tell me how much new lithium and other mineral processings will be required in the United States to meet this new requirement under the tailpipe emissions proposal?
And I think you mentioned 2023, but actually we're looking at 2032.
2030, I'm sorry, yes,
Okay.
thank you, 2032, I got my numbers flipped, yes.
I think that's important because
Yes.
in this proposal, we're soliciting comments because we have a
Yes.
build-out time.
So how much lithium and other material processing will we need by 2032?
Well, I think we need more, right? And I
Okay,
think
how many lithium mines do we have today in the United States?
I'm not quite sure.
How many lithium processing?
I'm not quite sure.
Well, my understanding is 0. It all has to go to China, and then it comes back to us. We have one lithium mine, and as you know, the permitting is such in America that it's going to be at least 10 years to get any new mines permitted. It is a dangerously dependent policy that's going to put us dangerously dependent upon China. Okay, I'm running out of time here. I wanted to get to the new human health water quality criteria for Washington State. And I wrote you a letter EPA sets these standards for PCBs at 7 parts per quadrillion, 7 ppqs for the state of Washington. It's unattainable with the current technology. It's undetectable with current EPA-approved test methods. Is EPA's human health water quality criteria that is unmeasurable, unattainable with current technology consistent, that it be based on sound science?
Yes, absolutely based on sound science. And thank you for the meeting yesterday. I still believe and maintain that permit is not in jeopardy. I think there may be some discrepancies between the state of Washington and EPA on those requirements.
Okay, thank you. So does EPA support states like the state of Washington right now using a non-EPA approved method for detecting PCBs to determine whether permit holders are compliant with federal standards?
I can tell you as a former state regulator that states have certain autonomy under the law, that they can go further than the federal government.
So they're using a non-approved EPA technology. Anyway, I'm also very concerned about 151 separate rulemakings. Have you done any work on whether or not this agenda is actually focused on, can you track how the nation's environmental quality has improved over the last 10 years? Okay, maybe I'm gonna have to follow up with a letter. Ran out of time. I guess my point is, I hope that we're looking at actually the impact, the results of these regulations, not just issuing 151 new regulations for Lord knows what purpose. Okay.
And if I might, all 151 aren't new, and many of them are court-ordered. As you know, from various administrations, these things carry over, so I would like to continue that conversation.
As you've heard yet again, Mr. Administrator, we're looking for a balance. Protect the environment, but ensure the safety, security, the energy security, the economic freedom of the American people. That's what we're looking for. The gentlelady, her time has expired. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, I wanted to ask the administrator about the Superfund program, which is so important to my home state of New Jersey. But again, by way of background, because I hear what the Republicans are saying, look, nobody likes regulation, nobody likes taxes, but part of the reason why we have a Superfund is because there wasn't proper regulation years ago, and companies did whatever they wanted and threw Agent Orange and all kinds of pollutants on the ground and in the water, and so we got to clean it up. And that takes money, and that's one of the reasons that I was in favor of reinstating the Superfund tax, which lapsed in '95, and worked to reinstate this, what I call polluter pays tax ever since, because I don't think taxpayers should have to foot the bill to clean up these toxic waste sites. That responsibility should fall to the polluters who created the problem in the first place. And so thankfully, we reinstated the Superfund tax last Congress through a combination of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So I wanted to ask you, how has the dedicated funding stream created by the Superfund tax reinstatement helped to speed up or increase the number of cleanups started by the EPA?
Well, thank you so much, Congressman Pallone, for your support of Superfund and the Superfund tax. We've seen an exponential increase in speed. In some communities, we've seen the calendars move forward by a year. In 2022, we obligated about $1 billion in bill funding at 116 Superfund sites. And, you know, we're using that bill funding to clear the backlog of 49 sites that were previously unfunded and did not have any construction occurring. So this is a significant shot in the arm in communities all across the country who are living in these blighted areas.
Well, thanks. Now, the funds provided by the tax obviously are helpful, but they do not cover every need of the Superfund program. So to that end, the budget requested an additional $355 million. So could you talk about those additional funds and why they are critical for the Superfund program?
They're very critical. You know, we're grateful for the leadership of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the billions of dollars from bill, but there's a gap. There's a deficit for a lot of communities, and you and I have been to some of these communities, and you understand that the impact on these communities is not only a health impact, but there's an economic impact. There's a psychological impact from living close to these blighted sites. And so this $355 million is really going to help communities all across the country.
Well, thanks. Now, the administration has also put a spotlight on environmental justice through its Justice 40 initiative, and that was championed by my late friend and colleague from this committee, Representative McEachin. So can you tell us, share how the Superfund and brownfields programs factor into Justice 40 and how the budget furthers the administration's Justice 40 initiative more broadly?
Well, you know, fortunately or unfortunately, the majority of these brownfield sites and Superfund sites are in low-income communities and communities of color or near tribal communities. And so as we've allocated this funding towards those who need it the most, we have met and exceeded the Justice 40 initiative, which is at least 40% of these federal dollars be invested in communities, and you see the benefits in those communities. We're very proud. In the first year of the Superfund program, I believe we were in the high 60% of those resources were going to underserved communities. And again, that's low income and communities of color. This is very important. It's very important that we have that Justice 40 floor, but in many instances, our programs far exceed that.
And I appreciate, you know, I think it's important that we talk about not just Superfund, but brownfields, right? Because there are so many more brownfield sites than there are Superfund sites. And although they may not be as dangerous because they're not on the national priority list or not as toxic per se, there are many of them. And so I do think that we need funding to help clean those up. It can't just be all borne by the state, otherwise it's not going to happen. But again, I'll just conclude by this, Mr. Chairman, which is, you know, the budget cuts and rollbacks that are included in the Default on America Act, you know, the one that the Republicans passed just before the last break, you know, to address, in their minds, the deficit, is really going to hurt a lot of this cleanup, and the funding cuts will really make it much harder for you to meet your health and safety goals. So I understand that they've expressed concern about how you're going about things, but the bottom line is if you have a lot of cuts from their Default Act, you're not going to be able to do a lot of the things that are so important for people's public health and safety. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Administrator Reagan, thank you for being here. Appreciate your presence here. Appreciate your presence in my district at the Georgia ports last week. I'm sorry that I wasn't invited, but my staff found about it the night before, and they were able to get there, so I appreciate them being there. But thank you for being there. You saw what an economic engine the Georgia ports are to not only to our area and the southeast part of Georgia and to our state, but the entire southeast United States, and the impact reaches all the way up into the Ohio Valley. So that's one of the reasons that I'm so concerned, because we've had a lot of growth and prosperity that's come to our district, and I'm concerned about some of these new rules that and regulations that are being pushed by the administration. I don't want to see that deterred. I don't want to see that growth and prosperity deterred. No one cares more about clean air than I do. And I say that sincerely. Where you were at is about 2 miles from where I grew up. I grew up right down the river from where you were at last week. And, you know, I would have people, when I was in college, come home and visit with me, and we had so many paper mills, they say, "What's that smell?" And I said, "That smells money. That's what it is." And that's what it was to us. The smell of a paper mill was money. And it put bread and milk and bread on our tables. I worked in the paper mill. My dad worked in it for 33 and a half years, and it was important. Just as these things that you saw this past week are important to our economy, and that's why I'm just concerned about the impact it's going to have, particularly the particulate matter rule, where the new air quality standards are that you're proposing for PM 2.5. For particulate matter particles that measure 2.5 micrometers or less in diameter. Even the EPA says that the United States has some of the cleanest air in the world, that we have done a good job. I believe there's a chart, you know, on your website that shows alongside the dramatic economic growth and even vehicle miles traveled, even through that, we've been able to accomplish some of the cleanest air in the world. And that's why, again, I'm just concerned about these proposed standards and proposed changes. you know, there have been some questions about the rulemaking process, and I'm concerned about the rulemaking process too. But I want to mention that in 2001, President Obama withdrew an EPA proposal to reconsider ozone standards, citing, and I quote in his words, the importance of reducing regulatory burdens and regulatory uncertainty, particularly as our economy continues to recover, unquote. Looking at the proposals, and do you recognize, as President Obama did, that the president, that EPA can consider regulatory costs and burdens when deciding whether to move forward with the discretionary air quality control reconsideration?
Absolutely. I think that we absolutely do a cost-benefit analysis for all of these rules, and PM 2.5 and ozone are obviously different regulations here, but this one that we've proposed, and we're still having a conversation, we proposed it, we're taking comment, would avoid about 4,300 premature deaths and get a lot of lost work days, and we believe the technology exists to do this. So there is a cost.
But aren't you concerned? I mean, you know, we got inflation, we've got, and you, again, you were there last week, you saw our economy's buzzing down there. We're doing great, and I don't want that to be deterred at all, and I'm concerned that this is going to do it.
Well, and that's, I was there at the Port of Georgia for a reason, which is that port is demonstrating that they are well-positioned for a significant chunk of that $4 billion that we announced from the Inflation Reduction Act. Those types of announcements that we're making to use those resources will help ports and communities all across the country comply with these regulations. The goal is to have our regulations be complementary of the resources that we're getting from these technologies.
And I admire that goal, but let's please make sure that we don't inadvertently or unwittingly do just the opposite and deter growth. I want to get real quickly to brownfields because I've got quite a few brownfields in my district, particularly in the southernmost part of my district in Glenn County. You mentioned the Justice 40 requirements. Can you tell me about those? How are the conditioning grants based on Justice 40 requirements?
Well, and based on the money from Bill, 40% of the benefits that result from the bipartisan infrastructure law must go into communities that have been described as disadvantaged or disproportionately impacted or low income. And 40% of the resources that come from the federal government will prioritize those disadvantaged communities.
We've got a real concern with brownfields. And this has been going on so long, I get so frustrated. These brownfields that I'm talking about in my district have been on the books for over 20 years, 2 decades. I'm going to follow up with some questions. I'm out of time, but thank you very much again for being here, and thank you again for visiting the district.
Absolutely.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right now, we have the opportunity to protect our environment, safeguard our public health, and strengthen our national security with clean energy from critical minerals found right here in the United States, like in the Lithium Valley, in the Imperial Valley, at the Salton Sea region in my district. By filtering out critical minerals from closed-loop geothermal brine, such as lithium, cobalt, and nickel, we can reduce the need for mining. Mitigating our use of mining can help preserve our natural ecosystems because it would lessen land degradation and water and air pollution. And as we know, lithium is important for battery manufacturing. We will need batteries for our clean energy future. But while we increase production of batteries for clean energy technologies and our consumer products, we also need to make sure that we are properly and responsibly disposing of them and not creating pollution down the road, especially and creating frontline environmental injustice communities. Okay? As the demand for lithium-ion batteries continue to grow, we must implement policies that promote circularity to ensure that we are getting the most of our natural resources and are protecting public health and the environment in the process. In addition to optimizing recovery of critical minerals like lithium, the proper disposal of batteries can decrease the chances of them potentially releasing hazardous substances into the environment or bursting into flames when mixed with other toxic chemicals at landfills. By reducing these environmental and safety impacts, we can also keep the public healthier. Improperly disposed of batteries can end up in landfills that have the potential to release toxic chemicals into the environment. These toxic chemicals don't just affect our soil and water, but also affect the air quality of communities nearby. We often see this in lower economic communities where batteries and other toxic materials are more likely to be dumped improperly. Communities like my own in California's 25th district. Improving how we manage our discarded batteries is an important component of strengthening our circular, or the reduce, reuse, and recycle economy. We need to ensure that we are focusing on solutions that maximize the value of recovered materials while protecting public health, worker safety, and the environment. Last Congress, my colleagues and I took action on this important issue through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which allocated $15 million for EPA to develop a voluntary battery labeling guidelines and $10 million to develop best practices for battery collection. I'm glad to see that the EPA has made progress on these guidelines and best practices and look forward to the positive outcomes that will result from these efforts. So Administrator Regan, can you please speak to the public health and environmental benefits of investing in this circular economy for batteries?
Well, thank you for the question, and I do want to thank you, before I answer, thank you for your leadership on the Oasis Mobile Home Park. We really appreciate your leadership on that very important topic. Absolutely, when I travel the country and travel the world, the issue that young people talk about the most is recycling, and a lot of it is focused on battery recycling. I'll also tell you that the private sector is laser focused on battery recycling. Thank you for the resources in the bipartisan infrastructure law to focus specifically on battery recycling.
So how do you think the voluntary labeling guidelines will help promote a circular and sustainable battery supply?
Well, it just makes the process easier. If you have the labeling done, and if you have a priority on these products, then it's easier to gain access to. You can understand and quantify the amount, and then you can build a market around it. And that's what so many of our private sector friends want to do. They don't want to use the energy to really go mine again if they can recycle, preserve, and use that solar panel again or use that battery again.
Yeah.
We're seeing that interest from the private sector.
So thank you for answering my call to have EPA coordinate and focus with the different agencies in my district around the Oasis Mobile Home Park. I believe with our leadership, we can really make the significant difference that's needed to improve clean drinking water so that our farm workers don't have to drink arsenic at toxic levels in their dilapidated water systems. But I also am putting a call out for the EPA to be forward-thinking and helping us mitigate or prevent creating new environmental justice frontline communities with these batteries that we're planning to manufacture in the district as well as around the country. So I'd like to work with you on helping to develop guidelines in the recycling and disposal of batteries to prevent another environmental injustice.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
The gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this is a very important hearing this morning. I want to thank Administrator Regan for coming before our subcommittee. You know, we talked about what folks are asking us or what folks are concerned about back home. You know, obviously our folks are concerned about inflation, the ability to, you know, meet the family budget, and obviously our future economic prosperity. They just don't see, I mean, it looks pretty grim out there, to be honest with you. And then, of course, from a national defense standpoint, our adversaries are there as well, and we compete in a world economic, it's a competition, and we have to, we have to stay on top to maintain our status in the world. Unfortunately, your budget is filled with a lot of burdensome regulations that will harm manufacturers and will increase energy prices for Americans, and that's something that, like I said, is a real problem right now in this country. I have a lot I want to cover, but I'd first like to mention that you can put me and my constituents on the list of those folks that are very unhappy with your WOTUS rule, and I know we're not alone. I next want to discuss an issue that has greatly impacted my district, and that is the chlorPFAS I represent a district where the #1 industry is agriculture. I want to take you back to a conversation you had at prior hearing for chlor-PFAS. Were you aware that your agency on June 24th was exchanging offers and closing in on an agreement with industry on 11 uses for this agrochemical? But then within 1 week, EPA faced lobbying from NGOs cozy with this administration and New York's Attorney General, resulting in EPA going a different direction.
I'm not.
You're not aware of that?
No, I don't. I'm not familiar.
You testified that you did not appeal the court's decision on the 11 uses. Was this because the United States government uniformly believed these uses were unsafe?
I think the Ninth Circuit had spoken up and had indicated they were frustrated with the pace of the agency. We took a look at the law and what the Ninth Circuit had required, and I think that is the result of the proposal that we put out.
You also testified that the court was clear with you that it was frustrated. However, an appeal would be before a new slate of judges. Did you have information that those judges were also frustrated with this issue?
I don't have any information on judges.
If a future judicial action remains this decision to EPA, can we expect a different outcome?
If it is remanded back to the agency, we'll look at the direction that the court has given us, and we'll try to govern ourselves accordingly.
Let's move on to another topic of concern. As you're aware, that manufacturers, utilities, and others pay attention to potential future regulatory costs and compliance costs when making long-term decisions to maintain or expand operations. And the more EPA signals and outlines what its plans for regulations, owners of facilities take that into account. Would you agree?
Yes.
So this coming Thursday, it's been reported you will be proposing new emissions regulations on electric generation. And this follows a number of costly EPA regulatory actions on the electric sector. We know from experience that some of these rules will never be implemented, but that's not the problem. The problem is EPA appears to be pursuing a strategy to send as many signals as possible that future costs are going to increase, and so owners and investors will decide to shut generation permanently. Administrator Regan, is that an appropriate strategy for the EPA to pursue?
It's not the strategy at all. I think I've been engaging with the utility CEOs in the power sector for close to 2 years now. They've asked us for some regulatory certainty. They asked us to be responsible in terms of looking at that regulation and how it coincides with the West Virginia case.
Well, you said y'all do cost-benefit studies.
We do cost-benefit analysis with every
Okay, so
rule.
if the cost goes up, then you say, what's the benefit?
Well, we look at the benefits not only to the economy, but to public health. We look at the benefits to lost work days, lost school days, premature deaths, loss of life. So there's a complicated scenario that we put this cost-benefit analysis together, and we'd be happy to brief your team on how we arrive to that.
The last thing we need is to have more burdensome regulations that will add to rising energy prices. And I thank you for being here today, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Johnson and Ranking Member Tonko, for holding today's hearing. And I'd also like to thank Administrator Regan for being here to testify this morning. I commend your leadership in ensuring environmental justice, combating climate change, and protecting public health, which are clearly top priorities for the EPA. As you are well aware, air pollution from diesel-fueled trucks places an unequal burden on communities of color. Exposure to air pollution like particulate matter and nitrogen oxide is linked to a whole laundry list of health problems, including asthma, heart disease, and stroke. The failure of our governments to secure clean air for our communities leads to thousands of preventable premature deaths each year. The last time you were before this committee, I asked about administration's Clean Trucks Plan, which set emission standards by heavy-duty vehicles starting in model year 2027. Now that the Clean Trucks rule has been finalized, do you have any estimate of how many deaths will be prevented because of the new emission standard?
Well, we definitely have that number. I will be sure to have my staff get that number to you for those years 2027 and beyond for those heavy-duty vehicles.
Wonderful. Multiple programs like DARA and newly created Clean School Bus Program focus on removing dirty diesel vehicles from our roads, but don't specifically prioritize electrification of other sources of emissions in the transportation sector, like refrigeration units on trucks or port equipment. I was glad to see the EPA recently released RFIs for the Clean Heavy-Duty Vehicles and Clean Ports programs created under the Inflation Reduction Act, which will help speed emissions reductions in this space. However, I wanted to ask about another provision in the IRA related to reducing diesel emissions. I worked with my colleagues on this committee to ensure the law included $60 million for reducing diesel emissions for good movement in low-income and disadvantaged communities. This provision was drafted with the express intent to ensure the eligible uses included the electrification of equipment outside of the vehicle's engine itself, like the electrification of trucks' refrigeration units or E-TRUs. What is the status of implementation of the Section 60104 Good Movement Program, and how is the EPA considering E-TRUs with regard to reducing diesel emissions in communities that are disproportionately impacted by these types of emissions?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for your leadership on this topic. Because of the conversations we've had, we've made it a priority. Just last fall, we issued a tool that specifically tracks emissions from these transportation refrigeration units. We're building a repository so that we can understand where they are, what the impact is, and we're actually trying to marry that tool to these TIC-TAC grants or these EJ grants so that communities can apply for those grants and address some of these issues quicker than probably the federal government can.
As a matter of fact, I'm pleased to see the agency's recent announcement of the Environmental Justice TIC-TAC program, which will build capacity and remove barriers for environmental justice communities to navigate federal grant programs. How does the agency's budget request support the critical work of these centers and connect the agency's broader goals of prioritizing environmental justice?
You know, it's a significant priority for us, and we don't pretend that the federal government has all the answers. So whether in New York or McDowell County, West Virginia, these TIC-TACs will work with local groups, local grassroots organizations who know their communities best, and we will provide technical assistance to these communities so that they are prepared and armed with grant writers and the understanding of the accountability for these federal grants and be positioned for the over $3 billion in environmental justice and climate justice grants provided by the Inflation Reduction Act.
Well, Administrator Regan, I want to thank you for your diligence and your hard work, your commitment to clean air, to cleaning up our environment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Administrator Regan, there appears to be a trend where the EPA is denying an increasing number of small refinery exemptions to the renewable fuel standard. The GAO put out a report that found that the EPA has not analyzed the accuracy of its assumptions that small refineries do not experience disproportionate economic hardship from the renewable fuel standards. And GAO's analysis found that small refineries have paid on average for compliance credits that are higher than the large refineries. And what I want to know is, why has the EPA not analyzed the accuracy of the assumptions used to deny the small refinery exemptions?
We have analyzed those, and you know, most of our, or all of those recent denials are in response to the ruling that the 10th Circuit gave. We had approved SREs as an agency in previous years. The courts ruled against that.
Are you saying that you're basing your rulings on the 10th Circuit Court, or based on your analysis that, are you saying that they're not paying more?
We've updated our analysis based on the losses that we've faced in court.
But are
to
they
be sure
paying
that
more?
we're on the
Are
right
the
side
small
of the law.
refineries having to pay more?
Well, I think the question is how we define the economic disbenefit.
The question is pretty simple. are the refineries being forced to pay more?
As the EPA Administrator, I'm only allowed to consider the economic disproportionate impact, not just to the refiner, but to the state and to a number of entities. So that's outside of our jurisdiction just to make a
Is that
decision.
you're admitting that the small refineries are being disproportionately impacted by your decisions on the renewables fuel span.
I don't have the
standards.
authority just to consider, I guess what I'm saying is I don't have the authority just to consider the question you're asking, which is, are the refineries being disproportionately impacted solely? That's not the way the
But you
SRE
do
program
have the
works.
authority to report accurately to Congress whether or not that is the case, so that Congress, if need be, can take appropriate action. The GAO also found the EPA's inconsistency in granting exemptions makes the agency's decisions to appear ad hoc, resulting in market uncertainty that can harm small refineries and renewable fuel producers. Under this current administration, gas prices have skyrocketed, and Americans are definitely feeling the pain. Why has the EPA contributed to high prices with its attack on small refineries?
I think the EPA's response is in response to the SREs that were given in previous years, and the courts denied those and said that the EPA acted outside of its legal authority. And so our decisions moving forward are based on what we believe our legal authority is in concert with the way and the advice that the courts have given us.
Well, you know, this is another example of this administration, you know, giving favorability to certain players in the marketplace, and it ultimately harms the American consumer. And I don't know why your agency wants to create this market uncertainty for the small refineries when everything gets passed down to the consumer, and it shows up. And it's, you know, I've made this point time and time again that energy is the most inflationary component in the entire economy because everything has an energy cost, whether it's gas at the pump or shows up on the utility bill or shows up at the grocery shelf. I want to ask you something else. During COVID, we sent a massive amount of money to the Small Business Administration in the form of the payroll protection plan, far exceeding their budget, and tasked them in a very short amount of time to distribute these funds to applicants, and it resulted in massive fraud. I mean, unprecedented in the history of the United States. Your EPA has about an $11 billion budget, but you're being tasked with distributing $27 billion from a green bank slush fund. That's my analysis of it. I want to know, and you have to do it by September of next year. Does the EPA, what have you done to ensure that there'll be no fraud and no mismanagement of this money, which is more than double? It's 2.5 times your budget.
Well, the first thing that I've done and continue to do is meet with my Inspector General, and as we design the programs that Congress has delegated to us to be sure that we have all of the backstops and protections in place to avoid any kind of wasteful spending. I feel really good that we've done a good job on the bipartisan infrastructure law, and we'll do a great job on the Inflation Reduction Act. And I am very well aware that there is a lot of oversight that is watching everything the agency is doing. So we're being very careful with these resources.
Well, I appreciate that answer. We will be observing very closely what happens with this money. We cannot allow ourselves to go through another situation like we did in COVID, where billions and billions of dollars were fraudulently taken. I yield back and recognize Mr. Sarbanes for his questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Administrator Regan, for being here. We appreciate you. It's a very, very tough job. You're doing a lot. You're juggling a lot of things, making real progress, though, for the American people. As a lifelong Marylander, I'm sure you understand that I've been a supporter of restoring the Chesapeake Bay, which is the largest estuary in the United States. It's a national environmental treasure. It's a regional economic engine. It's been one of my top priorities since I've come to Congress. And over time, as the bay's health has been negatively impacted by locally produced nutrient runoff, rising sea levels due to climate change, the loss of coastal and marine habitat, and other factors, EPA's Chesapeake Bay program has been absolutely critical to facilitating the complex cross-state effort that is imperative restoring the Bay. Only EPA can, in a sense, bring the regional impact to this effort. And the Bay program is a unique partnership, as you know, that brings together the 6 Chesapeake Bay watershed states, Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Delaware, New York, the District of Columbia, the Chesapeake Bay Commission, and the federal government. So it's really all hands on deck. Each Bay program partner uses its own resources to implement Bay restoration and protection activities, while federal Bay program funds are used to coordinate the complex multi-state science, research, modeling, monitoring, data collection, and other activities that are essential to support partners' collaboration. This year, EPA has requested $92.094 million, a little over $92 million through its geographic programs for the Chesapeake Bay program, an amount equal to last year's enacted levels. And I'm pleased to say that, you saw that as a historic investment last year in the program's critical work. With these funds, the Bay program has been able to make significant strides in meeting the goal of restoring the Bay by 2025. We're not there yet, but those goals are set forth in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. As we rapidly approach that 2025 deadline, can you share the progress that the record level of funding which has been brought to bear has allowed EPA to make on this goal?
Absolutely, and thank you for your leadership and support of that funding. We have almost reversed the decline of oysters, freshwater mussels, and subaquatic vegetation. Wastewater treatment facilities have been upgraded, and an increasing number of counties and municipalities have stronger stormwater programs that are reducing that combined water sewer spillover into the Bay. I am very proud to chair the Chesapeake Bay Executive Council and have spent some time with the governors of Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania, and I think that those resources give my staff the capacity to have very serious conversations about how we meet these goals while understanding the tough road that the agriculture community has to follow in order to help us to meet these goals. And so I think everybody's rowing in the same direction, and we know that we're protecting an ecosystem and an economy and a way of life. And so those resources are very precious to us.
Thank you. As I'm sure you're aware, Republicans have proposed some limits on discretionary spending that would likely impact the Chesapeake Bay program and its ability to support states in their coordinated effort to meet the 2025 deadline. What challenges to meeting the shared goal we have of restoring by 2025 still remain, and how would cuts to the program, the Chesapeake Bay program, at this critical juncture threaten our ability to sustain the progress that we've already made?
I think, what I don't think I know, the governors of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, and in some of the other borderline states would say that this is an all-hands-on-deck approach right now. And yes, we are not going to meet our 2025 deadline, as some had hoped a couple of years ago, but we're redefining what success looks like. If we don't get these resources, we won't be able to have the innovative programs on the ground to meet these restoration goals, and it will have an impact on the economy.
I agree with you 100%. Without the strong and continued investment that EPA has requested for the Chesapeake Bay program in fiscal year 2024, the risk is we could jeopardize decades of work and collaboration towards the Bay's restoration. This is absolutely not the moment to pull back. It's got to be full steam ahead, all hands on deck, as you said. This is the moment to act. We have to provide the resources that are necessary to achieve the full measure of the Bay's restoration. So I appreciate very much your testimony here today, and I'll just pick up on something you mentioned a moment ago, which is the agricultural runoff dimension of this continues to be a huge challenge. We're in a year also where we're looking at reauthorizing the Farm Bill, and I think that conversation cross-agency is going to be very important to the success of the Chesapeake Bay program. Thank you, Administrator. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, my colleague from Zanesville, Mr. Balderson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Regan, Administrator, for being here today. We've dabbled a little bit around it with the automobile piece, but Administrator Regan, in the EPA's proposed rule for emission standards for the model years 2027 and later on light and medium-duty vehicles, The EPA claims the proposal is estimated to increase electric power in use by EVs by between 0.1% in 2028 and 4.2% in 2055. The EPA also notes that because U.S. electric power utilities generally have more capacity to produce electricity than is consumed, the expected increase in electric power demand attributed to vehicle electrification is not expected to adversely affect grid reliability. However, NERC's most recent long-term assessment noted government policies for the adoption of EVs and other energy transition programs have the potential to significantly influence future demand and energy needs. Further, NERC's assessment provided an example from California where the California Energy Commission estimates a 25% increase or 5,500 megawatts in demand at midnight and a 20% increase or 4,600 megawatts of demand at 10 a.m. on a typical weekday by 2030. This added electric load is solely from plug-in EV charging under the state's zero-emission vehicle targets. Administrator, do you still believe this rule, which will require 2/3 of new light-duty vehicle sales by 2032 to be fully electric, will have no impact on our grid reliability?
No, I don't think it will. I think that in concert with proposing the vehicle rule, we're also preparing to announce a power plant rule. We're looking at both of these in concert, having a lot of conversations with our grid operators, a lot of conversations with the power sector, who, by the way, are really looking forward to these new customers being on the market. And we're looking at the investments that DOE and others are making into our grid. So there's a lot of technology that's coming to bear. And by the way, I think when you look at our proposed power plant rule, we're not sacrificing the role that natural gas plays. There are technologies in there like CCUS and others to keep that base load. So we feel like there's a really good, solid picture that we're painting as a regulatory agency. Obviously, both of these rules will be out for proposal, and we look forward to an active engagement and conversation on this.
Okay, thank you. Look forward to continue working with your staff and following up on some of this information and estimates with this. So we'll look forward to working with you and your staff. My next question, Administrator, is this tailpipe emissions proposal references the joint memorandum of understanding between the EPA and the Department of Energy to provide a framework for interagency cooperation and consultation on electric sector resource adequacy and operational reliability. As Chairman Johnson discussed earlier, this memorandum notes that the EPA and Department of Energy will engage with stakeholders that include power companies, relevant trade associations, state public utility commissions, regional transmission organizations, and independent system operators, NERC, and more. When drafting this proposed rule, did EPA engage with any of these stakeholders? And did any of these stakeholders raise concerns that this rule would negatively impact the reliability of the electrical grid?
We absolutely engage with all of those stakeholders. I think the chairman raised a letter that one particular regional planning organization raised. We talked with them. We believe that in our proposal, we will have addressed many of those concerns. But again, I want to stress, these are proposals. We want to actively engage with all of our stakeholders. And I do want to say that MOU between the Secretary of DOE and I is because I take reliability and affordability very seriously. Want to be sure that there are no stones unturned and that our two agencies are working hand in hand to ensure that as we put these rules out.
Okay, thank you very much. My last question, 40 seconds. Administrator, you gave 5 years ago, Congress gave EPA funding to come up with rules for the RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, coal ash permit program. When EPA issued its proposal in 2020, it has yet to finalize these rules. Given the administration's concerns about potential noncompliance at coal-fired utilities and the general consensus that implementing a coal ash permit program is the quickest and most efficient way of addressing compliance, why has the EPA delayed finalizing the rules for this permit program?
We're working very diligently on that rule. We're having interagency conversations. Obviously, the disposal of coal ash will have an impact on cost and reliability and all of those good things. So we want to be sure that we're incorporating how you deal with that waste with the other programs that we have in place.
Okay, look forward to following up with you on that process too. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Fulcher from Idaho for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Regan, thank you for being here today. Appreciate your input. And I'm from the great state of Idaho, and before having this conversation, we reached out to some of our constituents to try to get some feedback on what would be important to them. And so my questions reflect some of that feedback. One thing the EPA is good at least according to the people that I serve, is adhering to deadlines when it tends to benefit them organizationally, but not so good when the deadline compliance helps industry. For instance, many of your agency's significant rules impacting most aspects of the agency, including precedent-setting ones, overlap each other and only provide the public 60 days to comment. Yet these same proposals ask for reams of detailed technical items from regulated stakeholders, and as administrator, you've refused requests to use your authority to extend those comment periods. So my first question is, why don't you grant extra time for industry to meaningfully address technical questions that get asked during rulemaking?
I think typically we have a pretty standard recipe for extensions. If there are certain criteria met, then my assistant administrators who manage those programs typically do. I'm not quite sure which one you're referring to.
And I will get you some specifics, and
Yes.
but the bottom line is that at least my constituents disagree with you on that. Why does the EPA alternately routinely miss deadlines in many other programs, such as permitting? The permitting process, that seems to be a process that gets missed on a frequent basis.
Which permits are you referring to?
In general, Mr. Regan, the permits seem to fall to the wayside, and the regulatory aspects seem to rise to the top. Do you disagree with that?
Yeah, yes, I'd have to know which specific. I think we're meeting our permitting deadlines for the most part. There may be permits or rules that fall outside of that.
We'll be happy to follow up on
Yes.
that. I want to also just talk about the greenhouse gas emission standards for heavy-duty vehicles, Phase 3. There's a proposed rule that the EPA has come out with that would set standards for heavy-duty highway vehicles starting at model year 2028 through model year 2032 and revise the greenhouse gas standards for that model year 2027. EPA's updated emission standards for heavy-duty commercial vehicles for the model year 2027 tightens the tailpipe NOx limits to a level 80+% below the current standard. That's 80, not 8. At the end of April, the Senate passed a Congressional Review Act resolution disapproving of the EPA rulemaking on the heavy-duty trucks. So the end result of this action, according to the heavy-duty truck industry, is that these regulations would increase equipment costs to manufacturers, fleet owners, operators. It would have a detrimental effect on pretty much the entire industry. Mr. Regan, how is this not an attempt to push out the internal combustion engine in the industry?
Oh, well, it's absolutely not an intention to push out
80%, not 80, below current standards by 2027.
The trucking industry, which we've had a lot of really good conversations, would say that the technologies exist to meet those NOx levels. They recognize that there's a disproportionate impact in our urban areas and many communities in terms of respiratory distress. But I will say that it's a proposal. We're in active conversations with the trucking industry. Would love to be in conversation with you and your staff.
Mr. Regan, I just have to say 80% by 2027 is going to have a devastating impact. And that is a direct link to our food security, the cost for our families and farms, the supply chain.
The NOx control technologies exist. That's not even speaking about electric vehicles, anything of that nature.
Let's say that it does. What about the existing vehicles on the road? I mean, trying to hit the accelerator button so quickly, especially at a time when everybody wants to follow the science, it simply doesn't support it.
Well, and I would say very quickly is right. We're not doing this overnight. There's a phase-in period, and there's a grandfathering period as well. So I would hate to leave you all with the impression that in 2027, 2028, these emission standards just kick in and everybody has to start over. That's just not the way the programs work.
I do have more, but I do need to also be mindful of the time. So I'm not going to go into the next one. I'll just close by saying this has got to be looked at further. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Administrator, thank you for being here. I speak for 750,000 constituents that are extremely worried about the overreach and the attack and assault on American energy. When you talk about loss of life, the single greatest prevention of loss of life over the past decade has been from the Permian Basin, which has helped 1 billion people worldwide extend their lives and lift them out of poverty. Last summer, the EPA released a regulatory agenda which included the consideration of a redesignation of ozone attainment in the Permian Basin. If this is finalized, it would impose serious regulatory burdens. In fact, the White House today just released their priorities. I'm sure you've seen them, for infrastructure and energy, and one of them says, prioritizing community engagement. Administrator, I've sent 6 letters asking for a meeting with the Region 6 director, Ms. Nance, and you know how many of those requests have come back answered to me? 6 of them. 0. Unacceptable. That's not community engagement. Is the EPA actively pursuing a discretionary consideration of redesignation of ozone attainment in the Permian Basin?
Well, you should absolutely be involved in those conversations.
Sir, we're not. And I expect after this hearing today that we will get a call from Ms. Nance.
Yes.
Is the EPA considering a redesignation regarding ozone of the Permian Basin?
I'd have to look into that. Obviously, that's a Region 6 issue.
But you're the EPA administrator.
I have regional administrators for a reason who oversee thousands of
This is the most prolific area of energy production in the entire world. If it were not for the Permian Basin, this country and the world would have serious problems. That's very disheartening to not know the answer to that. Let's go to the next one on the natural gas issue, the natural gas tax. Look, my constituents are extremely worried about the overreach. Congress sets laws. Congress passes new laws. The unelected bureaucrats, to my knowledge, have not been to my district in at least 5 years. We've gone back, haven't seen an EPA administrator or director do the community engagement. Given Congress's clear intent to exempt marginal wells defined by less than 15 barrels a day and small producers, how does the EPA plan to communicate, if at all, to operators that were not reporting on the date of enactment of the IRA, that they do not have to comply?
The IRA is a law that was passed by Congress that was delegated to the EPA. The EPA hasn't voluntarily established any taxes. So I'm not quite sure I understand the question. We do have a natural gas proposed and supplemental rule that the industry actually asked us for at the beginning of the administration because they wanted some regulatory certainty. I think in the IRA, there was $1.5 billion proposed.
And how will the EPA communicate on how to follow those?
We're community engagement. Number one, we've been communicating, and as a matter of fact, we've gotten a lot of feedback from the natural gas industry on how they want that $1.5 billion spent. We know they want it spent on mitigation. We know they want it spent on technology. We're designing that program right now with their input.
There are many trade organizations that would disagree with that characterization, that have not been contacted, that do not support this and support my legislation to repeal the natural gas tax so that they can produce. Because here's the important thing. 80% of our production comes from independent producers. Those marginal wells, 80% in this country, over 80% of the wells we have in this country are marginal. And so
you would have to overturn that law before I could not abide by the law.
Well, we want to know how you're going to inform them. And you know, I got 2 more questions. Sure. It's a very worrisome thing. It's overreach. And my constituents who are actually lowering the cost of energy and doing the work are at risk. The entire country is at risk, but they have not been engaged in this. They have not been consulted, and that's very troublesome. Representative Vesey and I, along with a bipartisan group of Texas members, recently sent you a letter urging efficient and fair review of the Texas Railroad Commission's application for primacy on Class 6 wells. Can you please give me a timeline for when that's going to be responded to?
That would be in the regional administrator's office, and
Again,
I will get back to you.
The 6 letters I've sent to meet with the regional director, these were questions I had for her, and and we've received no
I
response.
will be sure that you get a response.
Administrator, we are extremely concerned. Energy security is national security. The Permian Basin deserves to have a fair shake when it comes to producing energy. We know how to do it better than anywhere else. And it's critical that the EPA not overreach, not do things that you know, again, as the chairman said at the outset, there's a lot of potential for good here. But when you don't communicate with us and you don't engage with us, we can't work together. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Miller Meeks. Dr. Miller Meeks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Administrator Regan, for appearing before us today. Representing Iowa, a lot of the work I do naturally focuses on ensuring biofuels, including ethanol, remain in the national energy mix. With CO2 capture during the ethanol production process, ethanol serves as a tool to reduce emissions associated with liquid fuels for on-road vehicles. With ethanol available as a viable fuel source, one that drives emission reductions, I have concerns about recent actions EPA has taken to prop up electric vehicles at the expense of ethanol and biofuels. This includes EPA's recent vehicle standards proposal and the SET proposal. Instead of focusing on only one solution, EVs, EPA should focus on a level playing field for all types of fuels and vehicles that can reduce emissions. The solutions from my bill, the Next Gen Fuels Act, are a great example of a pathway to reduce emissions and cost with cleaner fuels and vehicles. Administrator Regan, the SET proposal creates an entirely new E-RINs program where electric vehicle manufacturers generate RINs. Under the Clean Air Act, the authority to generate RINs is given to any person that refines, blends, or imports gasoline. Now, I will also say, in quoting you earlier from this hearing, you said, hopefully I'm quoting accurately, you're a strong supporter of E15 and biofuels. And personally, I appreciate the EPA's recent action on E15 for this year and look forward to a permanent solution. However, it seems punitive since Congress specifically designed the RFS program to encourage the use of domestically produced biofuel blends. Under what statutory authority did EPA use to allow electric vehicle manufacturers to generate E-RINs and participate in the RFS program?
We don't have.
You have no statutory authority?
We don't, no. We don't
Thank
have
you for
an
that.
E-RINs program.
EPA's SET proposal also establishes volumes for advanced biofuels and biomass-based diesel that are below current blending levels and significantly lower than the expected growth of the biofuels industry. Last year alone, companies announced $6 billion in investments for 21 projects that would deliver billions of gallons of biofuels as soon as this year. Why did the EPA set volumes at such a low rate?
We don't have a final E-RINs program. It doesn't exist, for the record. Number two, this administration has set the highest RVOs ever in EPA history from 2020, 2021, and 2022. As we look at the
For biodiesel?
As we look at the set rule for 2023 and beyond, we have proposed, and let me just be clear, I have engaged mightily with the biodiesel industry since we proposed that rule, and we haven't finalized those numbers yet. So
The
I think
biofuels industry is engaged
premature.
mightily with me as well.
I think
and
it's
they were
premature.
disappointed at the volumes. So, and I was also interested, you talked, I think it was Representative Fulcher asking you about the energy needed for electric vehicles, and you, I think you indicated that you think that there is enough energy production sources at this point in time to meet the EPA's emission standards, which would, I won't say mandate, would veer us towards 67% of vehicles on the road being electric. Are you aware how many vehicles, passenger vehicles, are on the road today?
I think your premise is at this day and time, these rules proposed for years modeled out. And so I didn't on the record say that you could get a 67% EV penetration rate today with this infrastructure and this environment.
You're saying you're
that's a disingenuous
bringing
statement.
online over the course of the next years enough energy production to meet a 67% change in vehicles to EVs?
I say that the rule proposes a range from 53 to 67, and we're taking comments from power plants, from grid
I just want to make
operators,
sure I
from a lot of
understand
people.
that, you know, we are currently at 13% renewables with wind and solar, 35% natural gas for energy. The biggest saving to life is in heating our homes and preventing deaths from cold. And that has been largely responsible to the Permian Basin. I think the most environmentally injustice thing that we can do, which was pointed out to us in one of our previous hearings, was to have energy production that does not keep up with demand, that forces people to lower their standard of living and not provide for them the energy to heat their homes, to put fuel in their gas tanks, and to buy groceries at an affordable level, hurting and putting at a disadvantage our most vulnerable. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Obalnolte, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Regan, thank you very much for testifying before us today. You answered some questions for Congressman Joyce regarding some of California's new regulations and their requests for waivers with your agency to enforce their rules. I'd like to talk about a different one, which is one that was passed recently by California, requiring that all outdoor power equipment be electric by model year 2024. Let me tell you why that's a particular problem for me. I represent a district that, ironically for California, gets a lot of snow. In fact, my hometown got a little over 11 feet this year, and a lot of people think that that sounds like fun, but I can assure you from personal experience that it was not. We actually had it better than some of my constituents. Some of my constituents were literally trapped in their homes for several weeks by the amount of snow that we received in the mountains of Southern California. So really the only savior for those residents is that if you live in the mountains, most people have gasoline-powered snow blowers. With those pieces of equipment, even though the county could not plow the roads to get out to them, they were able to plow enough to be able to get out to the grocery store. We resupplied the grocery stores by helicopter, if you can imagine, to try and get medications and foods to those residents that needed it. Here's the problem. There are electric snow blowers that are available. I have used those electric snow blowers, and I assure you that they're adequate for a couple of inches of snow, but not 5 feet of snow. They absolutely do not work. And so I'm fearful that this new regulation is going to be completely unworkable for a lot of the people that I represent. So the state of California has applied with your agency for the waiver that will be required to enforce this rule. And I'm wondering if you could tell us what the status of that waiver application is.
I don't know the status of that waiver application, but I can tell you I'll prioritize it and we will get back to you.
All right. Do you share my concerns with the implementability of some of the provisions of that rule?
At face value, it sounds very challenging.
Okay. Let me put something else on your radar before we leave this topic. Another problem that I have with this proposed rule is that the vast majority of the manufacturers of equipment that's compliant with the rule are foreign manufacturers, and there are hardly any, if any, domestic manufacturers that have equipment that is compliant with the rule. So implementation of the rule will have the effect of shifting the provision of this equipment completely to foreign manufacturers at the expense of our domestic industries, which I think would be a very dangerous thing to do. So I appreciate if you could give me an update on that when you know. I'd like to ask a little bit about the EPA's budget request, since that's the topic of this hearing. You have proposed a 19% expansion in the EPA's budget, and I find that a little puzzling given the fact that under the IRA and the IIJA, the EPA has received over 1,000% increase in total funding. So I'm wondering, with all of this extra money coming into the EPA, why is it necessary to increase the base budget of the EPA by 19%?
Well, obviously there are some restrictions on the bill dollars and IRA dollars as it relates to being able to hire staff on our enforcement side, which the Inspector General has indicated that is a must-do for us. As we think about approving these new herbicides and pesticides for our agriculture community, we have a deficit of staff there to get those new products on the market. We've got a lot of these products that are tied up in court, like chlorpyrifos and others. And so the courts have gotten a little bit of a jump on us, and we need to fight those fights, but we need to get new products on the market. And then we have to comply with TSCA, and we have to look at some of these deadly chemicals, asbestos and others that we need to begin to regulate and rein in. And so many times the IRA and the bill dollars do not correspond with some of the core programs that EPA is required to manage by statute.
Okay. You mentioned in that response the Office of the Inspector General within the EPA. The Inspector General recently testified at a hearing with the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and in his testimony, he said that the EPA has a high risk of waste, fraud, and abuse in the EPA's allocation of IIJA and IRA funds. So I found that very concerning. How will you ensure that waste, fraud, and abuse that the IG is concerned about does not occur?
Yeah, I just met with the IG a couple of weeks ago, and he did not convey that to me, but I'll put that on the list of things to chat with him. He's meeting with either myself or my deputy administrator on the execution, implementation, and design of the Inflation Reduction Act bill, our EJ dollars, and the like. I've tried to develop a very strong relationship with our IG because it's important to me that we maintain our integrity and the responsibility of, shepherding these dollars. And so I'm interested in the partnership with the IG.
Right. Well, I think we're all on the same team with respect to that. I thank you very much for your testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. One of my first questions, since this is a budget hearing, is you're requesting a 20% increase, $2 billion extra. What is that primarily for? Is that for hiring extra people to administer the countless new rules that we're implementing? What is it for?
85% of that requested amount goes to our states and our regional programs for the delegated execution and implementation of the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. A significant amount of that we hope will be used also for, as I was explaining earlier, to focus on getting our herbicides and our pesticides and new market entrants out there. Then we have resources that we're asking for on the enforcement side, which the Inspector General said we need to beef up. And then we have TSCA and some other programs as well. So it is sort of a base budget, but it's also 85% of that. I want to stress that. 85% of that goes to our state partners.
Okay, but to do what? Like, what do you need more money for? Is it to hire more people to implement these projects? Is it a hiring thing, or is it?
It's a mixture.
Still not clear what the money.
We do want to hire people. We do need additional capacity, but we'd also need resources for grants and other programs that, again, pass through to our tribal programs, to our state programs. So it's a mixture.
But how is that possible? The EPA got $60 billion in funding for projects and grants from the Infrastructure Jobs Act, another $41 billion because of the IRA. How could you possibly need more money on that front? I assumed that this $2 billion was to hire more people, but of course that doesn't make sense because your budget in 2010 was more than it was in 2023, and you had 2,000 more employees, so it seems like you can hire within your current budget.
I think that we all know that with congressional spending comes strings. We can't use bill dollars and IRA dollars to focus on pesticides, herbicides. We can't use those dollars to focus on TSCA. So those programs have specific spending requirements, and in order to stay within the letter of the law, we wouldn't dream of using those resources for things that are outside of those.
All right. Well, let's talk about things like pesticides and herbicides and the 151 regulatory proposals being considered right now. I don't have faith that the EPA is considering the cost to the American consumer, to the American worker, to your middle-class Americans that we are claiming to protect with these regulations. I don't have faith that the EPA takes that into account. There's things like this new rule proposing, there's a proposal for tailpipe emissions for light and medium passenger vehicles. Makes it harder for our most economically disadvantaged people to afford a car. I mean, is that taken into account? What kind of economic considerations are taken into account? What kind of cost-benefit analysis is taken into account with regulations like that? Whether it's that, or the plastics regulations, or additional regulations on herbicides and pesticides that hurt our farmers and make our food more expensive than it already has been made by the massive amounts of inflation. Is that being considered by the EPA?
It is, and I think that
How?
for those who are following, I think there's been 40 to 50 years of the Environmental Protection Agency not following the Endangered Species Act. Now we have the courts determining whether it's dicamba, chlorpyrifos, or all of these pesticides or herbicides that have to come off the shelves. Again, I said earlier, we're going to fight and we're going to litigate against that, but at the same time, the agriculture community has already said that there are a number of new market entrants that need scientific approval so that farmers have more tools. We need the people and the ability to get those tools out to our farmers. I spend a lot of time with our ag community, so I know that that's a real priority for them.
I have a question because there's a lot of additional regulations and rules being put forth on the oil and gas industry, but you do acknowledge that natural gas is the primary driver down of emissions in the United States over the past 20 years.
Yeah, natural gas plays a significant role in driving down emissions and energy security.
Sure, and so, when 50% of our global emissions for power production come from foreign coal, you got to agree with the math here that we'd benefit, if the goal is lowering global emissions, we'd benefit greatly from exporting more of our natural gas, which we do cleaner than anyone else, to other countries and displacing their coal production.
I don't get into the export or import of natural gas, but what I can tell you is our technology standards and the Inflation Reduction Act specifically focuses on carbon capture and sequestration for a reason.
I like that part of it, but the methane, things like the methane tax, they hurt all natural gas producers. It's not a well-written rule that actually just targets methane. It hurts all natural gas producers. So, you at least acknowledge that if we're not doing it, if we're not producing that kind of product, somebody else will, especially when by 2050, the demand for global energy will increase by 50%.
What you're referring to as the methane tax was written by Congress, not by us. I think our proposed regulation of methane is something that the industry asked us for on day one in this administration, and we're working with the industry. I think there's a lot of gas or lost product that's going to be captured. I think there's some technologies that we're looking forward to, and so we're having that conversation.
All right, well, I'm out of time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Pence, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Tonko, and thank you, sir, for being here today.
Thank you.
Since joining the Energy and Commerce Committee, I've been raising alarms on the impacts of this administration's rush to the electrification of our transportation industry before we're ready or before we've considered a lot of the elements in the distribution chain. Having spent my career distributing energy, this administration is completely disregarding the logistical challenges of ensuring the right amount of energy is where it needs to be, when it needs to be, and in the quantity that is needed. 2.5 years later, we're seeing potentially catastrophic impacts play out in real time. Grid operators, sir, are raising red flags to me all over the state of Indiana. Power plants are prematurely retiring and taking baseload power off the grid. Local utilities are waiting 12 to 18 months to get electrical transformers for neighborhoods to handle increased demand. I met with a large 2 million square foot building developer that says I don't have the power coming into the area. There's not enough out there in the marketplace. Even EV companies are tempering expectations for investors because, simply put, people aren't buying EVs as projected. And now the EPA is charging forward with brand new rules to prop up the EV industry and force consumers to ditch the ICE vehicles. Ultimately, this administration's one-size-fits-all approach will leave consumers in my district holding the bag. The EPA's proposed rule to create E-RINs, and that'll be my concentration, sir, for electrical vehicles is troubling proposal that extends far beyond the intent of the renewable fuel standard. I'm concerned that this proposal is just another funding stream for EV manufacturers to recover investments and stay afloat despite underwhelming sales. Instead of generating RINs at the point of blending, as I have done in my career for many, many years, this proposal creates a convoluted process, which is unspecified at this point, to award credits to the car manufacturers. The proposed rule even suggests an opportunity for a host of different stakeholders to generate E-RINs, including public charging stations and renewable energy developers. By inviting an entirely new group of stakeholders into the RIN generation through E-RINs, you could be setting up a program that is rife with fraud and abuse like the original RIN was. Even major oil companies had trouble and fraud was committed against them. Mr. Administrator, in my estimation, this proposal could set the stage for higher compliance obligations for refiners to buy E-RINs and ultimately subsidize the OEMs, and in some cases, the OEMs will have to buy E-RINs. According to the rule, EPA estimates 600 million E-RINs could be generated in the 2024 and 1.2 billion in 2025. I have seen firsthand instances of fraud and abuse in the traditional RINs market. My question, sir, how will the EPA prevent fraud and abuse in an even more complex E-RINs market as being discussed, and I know it's not finalized?
Well, thank you for that, and I would say that a lot of what you said, I share some of those concerns up until the fraud, waste, and abuse, because I think we can put programs in place to avoid that. But you've raised a lot of valid concerns that we've received during the comment period, which is why we're taking a very strong look at those concerns, and that will dictate how we move forward and whether or not we finalize the E-RINs portion of this program.
So, you know, I'm a little, one of the elements of this, I'm concerned about kind of double creation of the same RIN, of an E-RIN. When I hear that the car manufacturer who actually, I understand the proposed creation of it, but then all the way down to the charging station is going to generate an E-RIN, that seems like double dipping. So I would caution the EPA on that. Second question, has the EPA carefully studied how this influx of credits will impact the market for traditional RINs and liquid transportation fuels, which is how many folks can comply with your existing regulations?
Yes, we're studying all of those things. Excuse me, and it's really important that you're raising these issues because I want to let you know we're taking them very serious. And we're studying these issues during the comment period.
So, and again, a person that did this pretty much all my life, I would close with, please be careful of simply creating a financial market here that creates a great deal of additional cost to the end consumer. I thank you and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Dingell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Administrator Regan, thank you for being here to testify. We all appreciate your continued leadership at EPA. I think I wish I worked a little less with you some days. And I want to commend, as Jan Schakowsky did, your Regional 5 administrator. I think our chairman's had more of your attention lately, but we've had too many chemical spills, and I've got a lot of other issues I'm worried about. Let me begin. As you know, I'm a car girl. The future of the automotive industry and its workforce is an intense priority for me, which you know. We have to accelerate domestic electric vehicle development. We're competing in a global marketplace. If we don't do it, it's happening in China now. And we've got to deploy them to meet our climate goals and compete with China. But in doing so, we cannot leave behind the working men and women who've built their lives and careers in the auto industry. Administrator Regan, as we make the transition to clean vehicles, there's a real fear that the workforce needed to help us make that transition is going to be left behind. As it relates to the EPA's overall work and the most recent proposed multi-pollutant emission standards rule for model years 2027 through 34, how is EPA working to address these long-term workforce concerns?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for being such a champion on these issues. As we've been developing these rules, we've stayed in contact with our labor unions. We've stayed in contact with anyone that's focused on sort of job creation, education, and the like, as we've designed and proposed this rule. Thanks to your leadership and the connectivity, we've also been able to at least establish early conversations with new leadership at the UAW. So I have to say that it's a priority. It's a priority not just for me, it's a priority for the president, as you well know. And as we continue to move forward with this proposal, I can assure you that the labor component, the supply chain component, the infrastructure component, all of these components are at the top of mind for how this rule could be executed.
Thank you. It must continue to be there. Water affordability continues to be a major issue for me and for all of us as well. It's a basic human right. In 2020 and 21, Congress authorized and appropriated $1.1 billion to HHS to create the Low-Income Household Water Assistance Program as a temporary program to provide water and wastewater bill assistance to low-income households burdened by the economic consequences of COVID-19 pandemic. I'm a strong supporter of this program, but it's going to expire at the end of this year. Families are struggling, and it's clear there needs to be a longer-term solution. The bipartisan infrastructure law authorized the EPA to conduct a study for establishing a similar pilot program to the LIH WAP program to help families who are struggling to pay their water bills. Can you provide this committee with an update on that study, and when can Congress expect to receive that report?
We'll give you a completion date on that soon. I can tell you that we've been working hand in glove with HHS on this affordability assessment, and we're scoping this study out. I think it's going to be on time and on budget, but I'll have to get you that date at a later time.
I suspect you're going to need additional resources, but I've got a PFAS question before I run out of time. Forever chemicals are everywhere in our modern society and are harmful to human health and environment. The EPA has proposed to designate the two most toxic forever chemicals as hazardous substances under CERCLA, for which I thank you because I've asked every EPA administrator when we're going to do that. But after EPA proposed to designate the PFOA and PFAS as hazardous substances, the National Association of Water Companies and others have written to Congress to request protection from liability for cleaning up PFAS contamination. My office has also heard from a number of water utilities from the state of Michigan with these concerns. Administrator Regan, how does EPA plan to address the concerns of water and wastewater utilities and other entities that have these liability concerns and claims that exemptions are required since they're not the original source of the PFAS pollution?
Well, and that's very much at the top of my mind, and I think EPA was only successful because of the partnership with DOD and USDA. I've worked with both secretaries hand in hand. The bottom line is we have enforcement discretion. We believe that CERCLA gives us that enforcement discretion. I want to be clear that the water utilities and our farmers and agriculture are not the target, but the target is those who are putting this pollution into our air and our water.
So how are we going to make polluters pay?
Number one, we're asking for resources to beef up our enforcement. Number two, we're already taking action against many of these PFAS polluters. It's very simple. Many of these discharges are illegal and have an adverse impact on public health, and we're going to hold these polluters accountable. We can do that with our enforcement arm because we have the authority already to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and it's good to see you again, Administrator. Thank you so much for being here. And before I ask my questions, I just want to thank you for your leadership on the water pollution challenges at the U.S.-Mexico border in San Diego. We are continuing to make progress to reduce transboundary water pollution flows into our communities, and in last year's funding bill, we included language to ensure funds from the United States-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement can support water pollution reduction projects in the Tijuana River Valley. We also secured $36 million for the Border Water Infrastructure Program. And on that note, last week, EPA and the U.S. section of the International Boundary Water Commission joined with Mexican officials to announce joint funding for 2 wastewater infrastructure projects. Those projects will reduce the risk of spilling up to 60 million gallons per day of untreated wastewater in the Tijuana River watershed. So thank you again for visiting San Diego, to see this environmental catastrophe for yourself, and for taking action to build these projects and stem the sewage flows. Today I want to talk to you about 2 of my other top priorities. One is catastrophic wildfires, and then again we've spoken about reducing superpolluting methane pollution in the past. I want to follow up on that. First on wildfires, poor land management and climate change are funding extreme wildfires in California. Those fires are now the largest source of particulate matter air pollution in the West, and they endangered our communities, our wildlife, and our ecosystems. To address the rise of catastrophic megafire, we have to bring healthy, low-intensity fire back into Western landscapes by increasing the implementation of prescribed fire and cultural burning. Now, I support strong standards to reduce particulate matter air pollution from power plants, factories, and other traditional polluting sources. I'm concerned that the current draft rule and its accompanying regulatory impact assessment would likely result in a significant reduction in burn days at a time when our agency experts are recognizing the need to significantly increase our use of beneficial fire. I also understand that the Forest Service has raised serious concerns about the proposed rule, given that it may compromise the ability of the Forest Service to deliver on its wildfire crisis strategy. If the proposed rule is finalized, what steps will you take at EPA to ensure that beneficial fire remains a powerful tool in the toolbox to reduce the likelihood and effect of catastrophic wildfire?
Well, as I've committed to the Secretary of USDA, we have a great relationship. We talk about a whole host of issues. This is one that's on that list. Anything that we finalize will not degrade the beneficial use of controlled burns, prescribed burns, and would be able to deal with wildfires. We have the flexibility to do that. We have an exceptional events clause, and we have other authorities under the Clean Air Act that gives some flexibility to these opportunities and operations. And so I'll continue to talk with USDA. My team will continue to talk with the Forest Service, and we'll be sure that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can protect public health and preserve this tool.
That's great. I think that's really important to have the big picture, because sometimes the regulations intended for something like a power plant are just going to apply the same way to some other setting, particularly here with the burning that we do need.
Sure.
On methane, last year Congress created a methane emissions reduction program, which includes a methane fee and $1.5 billion to reduce methane emissions from oil and gas operations in the United States. Mr. Administrator, how does EPA plan to spend this money to maximize methane emissions reductions, especially to help smaller producers and to support new advanced continuous monitoring technologies?
Well, EIRA directs us to revise our greenhouse gas reporting program regulations, especially on methane that is based on empirical data. And so we're going to meet that obligation. We have an extensive outreach going on right now with the industry. It started with our proposed rule and our supplemental rule, and it's blending right in with the $1.5 billion because those two programs go hand in hand. So we'll continue to gather the data, develop that process that IRA dictates, and continue with our outreach to the industry.
Thank you. And some of my Republican colleagues have raised concern about the implementation of the methane fee. I think they've raised good questions in good faith. I'd like to give you an opportunity to address it. Can you update us how EPA plans to implement the program in a science-based and effective manner?
Well, science drives everything that we do. And again, it goes back to the answer I just gave. We have a greenhouse gas reporting program, regulations to ensure that the reporting is based on data. So data and science will drive this opportunity. And listen, I think the industry advocated for these resources for a reason, and we understand what that reason is. That's to help with technology and mitigation. So we're going to be sure that we do that. We want to honor the full intent of that $1.5 billion in IRA.
Great, I appreciate that. I'm sure my colleagues who represent the industry appreciate it as well. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Tennessee.
Thank you,
Ms.
Mr.
Barger,
Chairman.
for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Administrator, for being here today. And I understand you're from North Carolina.
I am.
Good. There's one thing that your folks and my folks in Tennessee have in common, and that's auto racing and their love for that. It's my understanding that EPA's Clean Air Act enforcement policy is focused on letting legitimate auto racers be able to race their vehicles. Is that correct, sir?
Yes.
That's good, because like I said, we love our racing. You've got Charlotte Motor Speedway, I've got Bristol Motor Speedway.
That's right.
And I'll tell you, what concerns me, though, is you cannot convert your car over for competition if you cannot get the right parts. And auto parts makers won't stay in business long if they are being hit with fines for product misuse after expressly warning their consumers against illegal misuse of their products. And it would seem to me that if a company that manufactures racing parts clearly communicates to the purchaser that street use is illegal, then the manufacturer and the seller should not be held responsible for that misuse. Yet this hasn't stopped the EPA from hitting them with tremendously expensive violations. Do you understand the problem that this creates, sir?
I do.
Okay. And the reason I'm asking is I have a hard time understanding why the EPA insists on penalizing businesses. And I'll give you an example. A business like Borla Exhaust, it's in my district, they're good actors. They've made an honest effort to get their products into the right hands and had no history of ever breaking the law until the EPA suddenly changed the interpretation of the Clean Air Act. And some people think that the auto parts companies should have to track every piece of equipment they sell, including manufacturers who don't sell their products directly to the end user. But I don't think it's reasonable to make the part manufacturer either an adjunct of the government's enforcement efforts or liable for its customers' failure to heed the printed warnings. This no-win situation that part makers are being placed in forces companies to either dramatically increase their prices of their racing parts to afford the newfound cost of doing business, or just exit the market, the racing market entirely, which is partly what Borla had to do because they got a $1 million fine. This situation also hurts everyday car enthusiasts who've always desired to work on their own car, but they don't have unlimited capital to purchase a purpose-built race car. Now, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like for you to answer these. Would you commit to working with this committee to fix the statute or the rules so that racing parts manufacturers can afford to remain in the market without the significant price increases affiliated with forcing manufacturers to track usage of their products by the end consumer? Yes or no?
Yes, and I
Great.
have been working with the
Awesome.
congressional delegation and the 2 senators from North Carolina on this as well. So we've been
Fantastic.
providing technical advice on
Fantastic.
this.
Would you commit to providing clear guidance, and I do mean clear guidance, to motorsports businesses regarding the production and sale of racing parts?
Yes, I would argue that we have enforcement discretion, and so we've sent that guidance out. It should be fairly straightforward, but if it's not, we'd love to engage in conversation.
Clarity of guidance is very, very important. As a pharmacist, I have to abide by what the FDA says, and when that regulatory agency comes into my door, it's up to the interpretation, and a lot of times there's no clear guidance. So that would be fantastic if you could clarify that guidance. And the last thing is, would you also commit to ensuring that the EPA provides clear guidance to businesses producing and selling performance auto parts that outlines the parts that can be sold for street versus those that can only be sold for use on the racetrack?
If we have not done that, I'll work with my staff to make that better.
Sounds like yes, yes, yes. That's fantastic. Now, I'll come to Charlotte next time if you'll come on up to Bristol, okay?
That's a deal.
All right, thank you, sir, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Administrator Regan. Thank you for all that you do to make sure that American families are benefiting from clean air, clean water, cleaning up toxic waste sites, and making sure we have a livable planet. We have invested a lot through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, in tackling so many of these issues. And so you have great responsibility now to follow through on all these. So I have a few questions for you. First, back home in Florida, local communities are thrilled that they're going to be able to tackle modernization of their water and wastewater systems. The Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund now will get investments that we just haven't had before. It'll help us in Florida. Clean water is really essential to our economy and our way of life. But when we had the Inspector General, the EPA Inspector General, in front of the Investigations and Oversight Committee, he said he was concerned that states have the capacity to this, because that's one of the initiatives where those monies stop at the state level. State capitals go through an analysis. They often have their rankings. And folks at the local level are concerned how, are they going to be able to tap these monies? Are those priority lists going to be fair? What do you say to that? How are you working with states and local communities to make sure that these very important dollars for clean water and water systems get to where they need to be?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for your leadership in ensuring that we are focused on this issue. As a former state regulator, many of these state environmental secretaries across the country I've met or know. My team is staying in close contact with all 50 of these state regulators. We've worked to redo the definition of disadvantaged communities. We've provided criteria for who these projects should benefit or be prioritized for. And so far, with the spending that we've seen over the past year, the states are getting it right for the most part. They present us with these intended use plans, and we approve them or disapprove them. Sometimes we have to say that list isn't quite right. We need for you to redo some of your homework. But for the most part, we're seeing states comply, and we're feeling pretty good. I will say we've only gotten 1 year, 1.5 years of multiple billions of dollars out. And so obviously, we're going to improve this process as we go along.
Are you hearing any troubles with just plain having the engineering firms that are ready, willing, and able? I mean, unemployment is at the lowest rate in 50 years, since the 1960s. Do we have the workforce necessary across the country to repair these water systems and modernize them?
I believe workforce is a challenge. In many regards, we do have the workforce in terms of the repair. Where we see a lot of challenges are operators and those who have the certifications to operate these water utilities that we want to be more sophisticated than those of the past. But I believe our Assistant Administrator, Radhika Fox, has her finger on the pulse and is really working with nonprofits, private sector, and our state secretaries to close that gap.
This is important because we also now have invested in EPA to help invest in our communities back home. And in the Tampa Bay area, folks who are in what we term environmental justice communities, the neighborhoods that have carried the burden of pollution for decades. I can think in Tampa, in the Progress Village, Palm River area, we're talking at the local level now about these are neighbors who are not on septic. Yes. I mean, they're not on wastewater, they're on septic. They still have drinking water wells. They're in the shadow of a huge phosphogypsum stack. And it looks like the EJ grant opportunities are going to unlock the ability to improve people's lives, maybe reduce their energy burden by doing solar. So now we have, how are you going to view like an EJ grant and greenhouse gas reduction fund and some other EPA grants? Can we stack these and combine them in an initiative, or once you get one, are you don't quite qualify for the next one?
We have multiple streams of grant opportunities that can be leveraged. There are many ways you can categorize these needs. And so if you have an EJ community, by the way, we've created these technical assistance centers.
Yes.
We took $177 million and we gave them to 17 organizations that are helping grassroots organizations build capacity to apply for these resources. And so there's opportunity to apply for wastewater dollars. There are opportunities to apply for EJ grants that tackle air quality issues. There are multiple opportunities for an EJ community to deal with the disproportionate impact that they've seen for generation, and we're building that capacity for them.
Good. Can you follow up on that point, too?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Curtis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Administrator, we've heard a lot, not just today in this room, but often in this room about reducing emissions and the importance of our global carbon footprint. And I'd like to discuss to you today, with you today, my concerns with your new chemicals office slow rate of approval in approving our next generation of innovative American technologies. You recently told the Senate that as an administrator that you respect the letter of the law. That implies to me everything the way it's supposed to be. Yet the GAO reported that EPA new chemicals reviews are getting increasingly worse at meeting statutory deadlines. I understand you don't meet any deadlines. Last year, you literally had a success rate of 0 on meeting deadlines. I find that statistically almost impossible. It would seem like you could stumble into a couple on time. And I'd like to know your response to that, and I'm certainly hoping you won't say funding. Under President Trump and President Obama, they had some of the same concerns, yet they made good progress on these issues. I understand user fees are up 600%, which is 25% of the overall budget. So can you tell me what the problem is and how we're going to solve it and why it's not a priority? It's not even in your budget objectives to address this. So why is it not a priority?
It is in our budget. We have asked for resources on the
I'm talking your
chemical side.
budget objectives.
Well, and so let me just say, you referenced.
And don't tell me money.
Under the Obama administration, the Trump administration, they did a better job. The courts would disagree with you, and now we're having to deal
Okay,
with
can you
all of those.
explain how zero is better than what's been done previously? I'm talking zero.
Number one, I'd have to look at that zero number, but number two, when you're having
Well, let
to
me
do
give you the
homework,
benefit of doubt and say it's 5%.
When you have
Let me give you the benefit of doubt, said it's 10%. How is that acceptable? Remember, these chemicals are critical for many things in the healthcare industry, reducing emissions, something we all care deeply about, and it doesn't seem like it's even on your radar. It almost feels like there's a purposeful, let's not approve these. Do you not like them? And then let me ask this. So you've also stated that you want to go back and review previous chemicals because they maybe shouldn't have been approved. How do you propose to do that when you're not even dealing with the current chemicals?
That's a good question for the courts. It's not that I choose to go back and look at these chemicals. The courts have mandated that during prior administrations that they didn't follow the letter of the law or they didn't use the latest science to evaluate these.
So you're telling me they did not follow the letter of the law. Can you give me some specifics?
The courts have remanded a number of decisions back to the agency and said, redo this homework.
Okay, so how do you propose to redo that homework when you're not doing your current homework?
The way you do that is, number one, you follow the law. Number two, you learn from what...
The law says, let's follow the law says, get it done.
It does.
Right? It gives you very clear deadlines. So we're not following the law.
So you're suggesting, though, that I can dig out from past transgressions and do my current job without adequate resources.
So what,
What
what are the, okay, tell me what adequate resources you're lacking. Fees are up 600%. What resources, why is it always about money to get things to do a better job?
I think we should take a look at the personnel that exists in this office today, and you can go back to 1990, 1980, 2000. We have significantly lost over 200 employees. We're down from like past offices, and so
So, Mr. Administrator, that's your job. That is your job. If you're down 200 employees, that is your job. Why are you losing employees?
Because Congress cut the budget. Because
your fees are up 600%. Don't blame it on us, right? Why is this always a money issue? You're telling me there's not a single thing in your organization that can't be fixed without more money? Productivity is tied into productivity.
We are working night and day to play catch up from what others didn't do correctly while trying to do our
Wow, do you know what
job.
that sounds like? Do you understand what that sounds like? It's like, not my fault, it's those other guys' fault. That's
I'm the
not
administrator.
acceptable.
I'm accountable.
Yeah, and
Which
so,
is why I'm asking you for
Mr.
the
Administrator,
resources, because I'm 200 people less than other.
how about a 600% increase in fees?
I'd have to revisit that number. That sounds like a sleight of hand to me. I don't. I'd have to revisit that number. But I
Okay,
can tell
here
you,
we are.
We don't have the people.
You want to
do the
revisit
job.
the zero number, you want to revisit the 600 number. Let's just get these things done.
I'd love to talk to you so we can revisit
Okay.
all of it because I want the personnel to get it done. It's
All
the
right.
ag industry,
Mr.
it's the
Administrator,
semiconductor
I'm out of
industry.
time.
All of these industries want me to do this, and I'm trying my best to do it.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I think it's interesting. Here we are talking about the lack of personnel, and yet we're looking at over $100 billion of out-of-cycle funding that has gone to the EPA on top of regular appropriation funding. And we're talking about not enough money to pay for people.
Yeah.
I think this is a
I would just like my last point to be, it's not always about the money.
That's right.
There are so many other aspects of efficiency, and so I'm fortunately out of time, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Batagon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to note for the record, it was under the prior administration, the Trump administration, that the EPA budget was effectively slashed. It was gutted. Certain departments were shut down. So can you imagine when you inherit an EPA that has that, how you have to undo all that harm and then get back up and ready, and then rehire people? I think that's what was missing from that last conversation. Anyhow, Mr. Administrator Regan, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for all the work that you do day in and day out, for your leadership to advance the Biden administration's climate and environmental justice priorities. EPA has been on a roll lately with proposals to reduce pollution from cars and trucks, reduce methane pollution, oil and gas wells, and mercury pollution from power plants. Thank you for all of that work. Last month, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus hosted an environmental justice town hall with Latino environmental justice advocates, climate groups, and EPA staff. We heard about the incredible potential for the $3 billion in environmental justice block grants in the Inflation Reduction Act to improve the quality of life in communities. We also heard about the challenges that we need to overcome to ensure that these grants reach the frontline organizations doing the work in our communities on the ground. What steps is EPA taking to ensure that these grants support locally led projects in communities that need them the most?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. There are two things I'd like to highlight. The first is we'll establish an EJ Thriving Communities Grant Makers Network with over $500 million from IRA. That specifically will give the resources to funders in every region of EPA, specifically in the communities. That will ensure that the money is going to grassroots organizations that have the capacity, and we are working with grassroots organizations to identify those. For those grassroots organizations that don't have the capacity, we've created the technical assistance centers. There are 17 of them across the United States. What we've done is we've chosen 17 organizations that have the ability to handle $10 million and begin to build capacity with grassroots organizations and community organizations. They will prepare them for the grant writing processes and the capacity to apply for that $3 billion in environmental justice dollars. So we're not being paternalistic. We recognize that we don't exactly know who should have these opportunities, and we're working with our partners to identify them, build capacity so that they can be competitive.
Great, thank you. There are dozens of startup, shutdown, and malfunction loopholes in the Clean Air Act that allow refineries, power plants, and industrial facilities to release huge amounts of pollution into the air of neighboring communities without consequence. Now, I commend EPA's work to close these loopholes in state plans all at once called a consolidated rulemaking. But the agency is also removing loopholes one at a time from EPA regulations. At this pace, it will take decades to eliminate them. Will the EPA take action to remove all polluter loopholes from EPA rules through one rule?
We've taken action. I will say we reinstated the 2015 SSM policy from the SIP call. And so moving forward, we are trying to work with a strategy as directed by the DC Circuit Court. I think what will be good is for me to have my staff work with yours to talk through how we're closing these loopholes under the letter of the law in a way that we can reduce pollution and protect communities.
Well, thank you. This is an urgent issue that myself and 24 colleagues recently wrote you on. These facilities are overwhelmingly in Latino and Black communities. A strong action would help fulfill the EPA's commitments to environmental justice. I want to thank you again for all your work, Administrator Regan, and I wish you luck in moving forward on IRA and making sure we're doing all we can. With that, I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. I want to point out, Mr. Administrator, budget proposals are just that. They're budget proposals. It's Congress that appropriates the money. And under the previous administration, the EPA's actual funding went up each and every year under the previous administration. So I just want to make sure that record is clear. With that, the chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate having the opportunity to wave onto this committee to speak publicly with Administrator Regan over the EPA matters. One of the things that I think you may want to do, Administrator Regan, is remind whether it's in this committee or reporting back to this committee, that there's a convolution sometimes when people say, for example, a department such as the EPA has received more funding. There's a difference between funding sent to a department so that they can get their work done versus funding in order for programs to give grants out to communities outside of the workforce within that department. So I think there might be a little bit of confusion or convolution as to what true funding is actually delegated to the department so that you can actually hire people and get your work done versus money that passes through to go out to communities so that they can get the good work done in the communities. So I just wanted to clarify that. So if you have the opportunity to do that, please do so, whether it's in this committee hearing or getting back to us with that, please. Also, I'd like to focus today on EPA's Clean School Bus program. As you know, last Congress, we enacted a transformational infrastructure package known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which makes $5 billion available to schools to replace their diesel buses. The genesis of this effort is the Clean Community for Kids Act, which I proudly champion alongside Congresswoman Hayes and Senators Padilla and Warnock. We know all too well the health risks posed to children when riding dirty, outdated diesel school buses. And it should surprise no one that interest and demand for electric school buses abounds in communities in every state of our great nation. And Minister Regan, when you launched the Clean School Bus program last year, $500 million was made available from the $5 billion Congress authorized and appropriated. The volume of applications you received for the initial $500 million funding opportunity was overwhelming. With more than 2,000 applications received from every corner of the country, these applications represented more than $4 billion in requests, the vast majority of which were for electric school buses. In fact, demand was so high that EPA increased the availability of funding to $1 billion for the first round. In short, the demands has far exceeded supply. More than 20 million students across the United States ride school buses every day, which exposes them to significant air pollution. Administrator Regan, is the funding provided to EPA by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act enough to clean up every school bus in America?
It's not. It's a significant shot in the arm, but you pointed out the demand for our program is just unbelievable. The majority of it is electric school buses, but we're also getting applications in for propane and compressed natural gas. And so there are a lot of low carbon solutions out there for low income, rural communities all across this country, and they're excited about this program.
So actually, some cleaner fossil fuel methods are allowed under this program.
Yes, about 90% of this is a voluntary program.
Correct.
90% of the applicants wanted an electric bus, and then about 10% wanted to look at propane and other fossil opportunities.
Which they have the option to do.
And we granted them.
Can you point that out? And you've granted not only electric school bus applications, but also other applications as well?
We have, and I can get those specifics to you, but if I'm not mistaken, there are about 10%, if not a little bit more, of those applications that we granted that were non-electric. And those that were requested and had a competitive bid in, we granted those.
Well, the reason why I appreciate the fact that you just pointed that out is because far too often in this committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, some of my colleagues try to make it seem as though the Biden administration and the Democrats in Congress are only interested in electric vehicles and not looking at a broader solution to make sure that we transition away from our carbon footprint today and actually clean up our act literally and get to the point where we can still have reliability, we can still have affordability, and we can still actually get it done while cleaning up our act. Is that the objective of EPA, is to make sure that we can transition effectively into a cleaner future?
Absolutely, and our numbers and our efforts and everything point to that and prove that. It's irrefutable data that exists.
Mm-hmm. And also, if you can get over to the committee with the few time that I have, if you can get over to the committee, the number of vacancies that you have and some of the titles of those vacancies as well, because many of them are experts who unfortunately are finding themselves in the private sector getting a lot more for their efforts than unfortunately we've been able to pay them in the public sector. Thank you so much for your generosity, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that will be the order. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to respond to the questions promptly. Members should submit their questions by the close of business on May 24th. Mr. Administrator, thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.